Story 1. My parents and my twin sister kicked me out at 16. I managed by living in a garage, and years later I got my own house. But now they arrive unannounced demanding to stay. Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, 28M, and this is the first time I'm telling my whole story. Sometimes I think it's easier to talk about embarrassing or painful topics with strangers on the internet than with my own family, especially considering what they put me through. So sit down, because this is quite long. I always thought my family life was normal, compared to my friends at least, until I grew up enough to understand what was happening behind closed doors. I was born in a small town in Colorado, United States, along with my twin sister Isabella. My parents, Henry and Camille, never hid that they desperately wanted a daughter. When they found out they were having twins, they felt relief upon confirming that at least one of us was a girl. I remember my mother's phrase on my 10th birthday. If we had only had Bella, I don't know how we would have managed a son. For me, it was weird to hear that, but I interpreted it as a silly joke, part of my family's questionable sense of humor. As we grew up, my sister became the priority in everyone's eyes. Isabella always received the best clothes, the biggest piece of cake, unconditional attention, and of course, my parents' defense against anything that happened. I wasn't a perfect child, I admit, but my mistakes were magnified. It was common that if Isabella and I argued over a toy, she would keep it, and I would be sent to reflect in my room, even if she had started the argument. My parents would make all kinds of excuses to justify the need to give her special treatment. She is a woman, Daniel. She has different needs, or my father's favorite. You are the little man. You must know how to yield. That began to sink in when I noticed that the balance was not only unbalanced, but completely tilted against me. Around the age of 13, I realized that instead of trying to make my parents love me equally, I should start thinking about how to survive their indifference. For them, I was the one who didn't fit in. There were small moments of affection, of course, but they seemed more like a way to cover up appearances with neighbors or distant relatives than genuine affection. Everything worsened when my maternal grandfather, a man I loved a lot and who understood me, passed away. He used to mediate in discussions, and although he didn't live with us, he occasionally visited and supported me with words of encouragement. But when he left, any spark of empathy disappeared in the house. As Isabella and I grew up, everything revolved around her. Her favorite sport, her dance classes, her meetings with friends. My parents tried to pay for camps or summer courses for her, while I could only make plans if I was accepted into free community activities or if a friend invited me. But the last straw came when we turned 16. Isabella started dating an older guy, about 19 years old, named Logan, who didn't have a good record. I remember that he worked sporadically in a motorcycle shop and had been kicked out of his house a couple of times. My parents, instead of worrying, saw him almost as a perfect son-in-law project to please their little princess. I didn't understand anything. How was it possible that someone who barely showed interest in his own life was better received than me in my own house? The discussions at home became constant. My parents didn't tolerate me questioning Isabella's relationship with Logan, and every time I dared to give my opinion, I received a huge scolding. It got to the point where my own father accused me of being jealous of my sister. It was ridiculous, but what was truly serious was when Isabella announced that she was pregnant. She said it one afternoon as if she were telling something trivial, and my mother, instead of worrying or being scared, started screaming with excitement, almost as if it were fantastic news to show off on Facebook. For his part, my father thought that the solution was to bring Logan to live with us. This house is small, but with organization, we will manage, Henry repeated, without bothering to ask me if I agreed. I didn't even have my own room. I slept in a small space that I shared with the washing machine and the dryer because Isabella occupied the large bedroom for herself. So, where the hell did they plan to accommodate Logan? The answer came without anesthesia. Daniel, you are going to have to find somewhere to stay. That's simple and blatant. I remember every word, every intonation. Logan and your sister are going to need privacy. Although I was barely 16, they dropped the responsibility of getting a roof away from the family home on me. I told them that I had no income, that I was still in school, but they simply replied that I was old enough to manage on my own. They also assured me that it would be a temporary measure while everything was organized, but deep down, I knew that they were kicking me out forever. It was their great opportunity to get rid of the son they never wanted. I tried to seek help from a couple of high school friends. But you can imagine, their parents were terrified of the idea of housing a boy whom his own parents had kicked out of the house. For them, that only meant problems, and I couldn't blame them completely. It was very difficult for someone to trust the version of an underage person without resources. The night I finally left with my backpack, I felt so humiliated that I could only think about the rage and the pain. I remember that I sat at the bus stop for hours, wondering who else I could turn to. Suddenly, I received a text message from an acquaintance, Ian, a guy who sometimes exchanged jokes with me in math class. He lived in a slightly more remote area, towards the outskirts of Denver, in a fairly simple house. His family rented the garage and a small tool room to people who needed storage space. Ian knew my situation and proposed that I stay in that garage for a few days, as long as I managed not to make too much noise and, of course, without his parents finding out. It's not ideal, but it's better than sleeping on the street, he told me, and I accepted. That was my first night away from home, in a dusty corner surrounded by metal boxes and car parts, without even a thick blanket to protect me from the cold. However, compared to the atmosphere of my own house, it felt liberating in a certain twisted sense. What I never imagined was that the nightmare had only just begun. Although my sister was the cause of my expulsion with the enthusiastic consent of my parents, that would only be the beginning of the humiliations that awaited me. Now, as I write this, I hope that at least some of you find comfort or inspiration in my testimony. If my parents and my own twin were capable of ruining my life at 16, I can also tell how I managed to get out of that abyss. After that night in Ian's garage, a mixture of relief and fear took hold of me. Relief because at least I no longer had to spend the night in a park or on a dark street. Fear because I had no idea how long I could remain hidden before his parents noticed my presence. My life, which until recently consisted of worrying about exams and video games with my friends, had changed radically overnight. The first weeks were a true survival experiment. Ian would secretly pass me some food, bottles of water, and blankets. I managed not to leave any indication that I was sleeping in the garage. I folded the blankets and hid them among the boxes, kept my space clean, and left very early so that no one would notice my movements. After a while, we both realized that sooner or later his parents would find out everything. Indeed, one night his father came to look for a tool and almost caught me sleeping. I was saved because Ian warned me just in time so that I could hide behind a pile of junk. Either way, I understood that my margin for maneuver was narrowing. Amid that tension, I tried to find a job that didn't require too many formal requirements. I looked in small fast food businesses, mechanical workshops, grocery stores, anywhere that could offer me a flexible shift and, above all, that paid me in cash. The issue of school remained in the air. I had been very close to finishing the year, but I had no support from anyone to cover even transportation costs, and the idea of showing up to class dressed in the same clothes as always and without a decent place to wash gave me enormous shame. Also, I didn't want social services to get involved, as I feared that I would end up in a shelter or, worse, returning to my parents' house, which I preferred to avoid at all costs. After several failed attempts, I ended up working for hours in a small family restaurant on the outskirts of Denver. To get there, I took 2 buses and walked almost half an hour, but at least I was paid every weekend. It wasn't enough to rent a place, but it was enough to eat something decent and save a few dollars for emergencies. Meanwhile, in the afternoons, I dedicated myself to wandering around public libraries and internet cafes to look for more job opportunities. I knew that if I managed to stay busy for as long as possible, people wouldn't notice my situation so much. The problem arose when Ian's parents, as expected, ended up discovering me. It wasn't even due to a mistake of mine. They noticed that in the garage, the pile of boxes moved frequently. When inspecting calmly, they found my blankets and some personal objects that I thought I had hidden well. The day it happened, Ian sent me a desperate message. "Get out of there, my parents know everything." And I had to run before the confrontation occurred face to face. Panic took hold of me as I walked down the street in the middle of the night without a place to go. I remember walking aimlessly for almost 2 hours until I found a park where I sat down to weigh my options. I called an old classmate, Julian, whom I knew from school and who also lived in the metropolitan area, but his answer was the same as always. "Sorry, bro, my parents don't want trouble." and I understood that I was alone in that fight. I tried to contact distant relatives. I had an aunt in Texas, a second cousin in Wyoming, but they were people with whom I didn't maintain a close relationship, and I didn't feel strong enough to explain my drama and beg them for a favor that, given the circumstances, could be easily rejected. In desperation, I did the unthinkable. I sent a text message to Isabella, my sister. For several days, I got no response, but one night she finally replied, "I don't know why you're writing to me. My friends think you're just doing it to bother Logan and me. Stop playing the victim." I was frozen. How could she be so cruel, being the supposed twin with whom I shared a womb? Although deep down I wasn't surprised. At home, she had always been pampered and accustomed to getting her way, and I had been nothing more than an obstacle, an addition that my parents tolerated so as not to look bad socially. I spent some time jumping from one place to another. Sometimes I slept on public park benches. Others I managed to stay in the service room of the cafeteria where I worked at night. The owner, an older man named Antoine, asked me about my family, but I always avoided the topic. I didn't want to give explanations or risk him regretting hiring me. He offered me some leftover food when he closed the place. It wasn't exactly a banquet, but it made the difference between going to sleep with an empty stomach or not. The breaking point came during one of the coldest winters I remember in Colorado. Being out in the open in the middle of December was a sentence of suffering, and to be frank, I thought I wouldn't survive. I needed a place to sleep indoors. With what I had saved, I could barely afford to pay for a cheap motel for a few nights, but something was better than nothing, so I invested my few savings in it. They were dark days of contained crying and heartbreaking loneliness. Amid that precariousness, I learned of a rumor that began to circulate in my old neighborhood. Apparently, Logan had lost his job, and with his first child on the way, my parents had to bear all their expenses. Worse still, the relationship between Logan and my father was not as idyllic as at the beginning. Discussions and mutual accusations followed one another. Ironically, that tense environment that had expelled me from home now affected those who had stayed. It could be expected that at any moment my family would come looking for me to ask for help, but no one appeared or bothered to know if I was still alive. Some months passed until I came across a small mechanical workshop that needed an assistant for the afternoons. "Looking for a young person with basic knowledge of tools and a lot of willingness to work," said the advertisement. I thought of my father, who used to repair everything at home, and I remembered that as a child I liked to watch him use the drill and the toolbox. I wrote a very simple resume with the few details I had and presented myself to the workshop. To my surprise, they accepted me. The owner, Thomas, noticed my desire to learn and decided to give me an opportunity. That job saved me in many ways. I began to receive a slightly more stable income, and my schedule allowed me to also keep the shift at the restaurant some weekends. With that extra money, I managed to rent a small room in the back of a house, not very pretty but warm and with its own door. Although I had to share a bathroom with other tenants, at least I no longer suffered the hardships of the street. I remember the first night I slept there. I simply threw myself on the mattress and cried out of pure exhaustion. Finally, a decent roof, I thought. Although it wasn't the luxurious life that my sister and Logan expected to have, it felt like the greatest of victories for me. I began to rebuild my life from that new starting point. By day, I worked in the workshop. By night, I occasionally covered kitchen shifts. I saved as much as I could, stopped buying unnecessary things, and focused on learning. Thomas taught me many tricks and skills. Over time, I became a valuable employee, which allowed me to aspire to better positions. School, unfortunately, I didn't return, but I began to take online mechanics courses, and I knew how to earn the respect of the people who hired me. It was hard, but I was determined not to let myself be crushed by the fate that my parents had imposed on me. And there I was, a 17-year-old boy who had had to grow up suddenly, paving his way without family support. The calls from my mother were reduced to zero. My father didn't appear even in my worst nightmares, and Isabella continued to be missing from my life, flaunting her supposed perfect love with Logan. However, time and effort began to bear fruit, and a spark of hope ignited within me. Maybe, I thought, my life is not condemned to always be a disaster. After a while working with Thomas in his mechanical workshop, I began to notice how my luck, or rather my opportunities, were changing gradually. It was not a fairy tale, far from it. I was still living with just enough money for the basics, and every so often feeling the weight of having left school unfinished. But at least I had a stable job, a roof under which to sleep, and a boss who trusted me enough to teach me everything he knew about motor vehicles, spare parts, and even basic accounting of a business. As the months passed, Thomas gave me more responsibilities, from ordering inventory to dealing with certain clients. Some didn't like dealing with a boy who was barely of legal age, but others found it interesting to see someone young and enthusiastic always available to learn. I remember that one day a man arrived with an old Ford van from the 90s, all dilapidated, and Thomas told me, "It's your project. Fix it as you can. If you manage to get it running, you get a weekend off." I threw myself into that task. At night, instead of going out with friends, to tell the truth, I didn't have many. I stayed reading manuals or consulting videos on the internet about specific repairs. Finally, after 2 weeks of obsessive dedication, the van started almost like new, and Thomas kept his promise. It was the first time in a long time that I felt a kind of self-pride. I began to save, motivated by the idea of one day leaving that small room and looking for something better. I was clear, however, that rents in Denver were very high for my income, and it was at that moment when a regular customer, Max, told me about a friend who was looking for someone to work on the assembly line of a car dealership north of the city. They paid a little more and offered opportunities for promotion with training. Although I was pained by the idea of leaving Thomas, he encouraged me, telling me that I wouldn't always have the option to grow in the workshop and that I should think about myself. So, with all the support of my boss, I applied for the new job and was granted it. The following weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork and learning. The dealership, located near Aurora, Colorado, demanded a very different pace of work, stricter hours, severe supervisors, and constant safety protocols. Luckily, my experience in the workshop was well valued. Although most of my colleagues had technical training or complete schooling, I managed to defend my position. I was able to rent a small studio, an efficiency apartment, near the bus line that connected with the dealership, so I no longer shared a bathroom with strangers. They were times of great effort, but each salary represented a step forward. Meanwhile, I had no news of Isabella, Henry, or Camille. If I had found them on the street, I probably would have pretended not to recognize them. I still felt a bitter resentment in my mouth every time I thought about the way they had kicked me out of the house at 16. I wondered how they had fared with the arrival of Logan's baby. From time to time, I received rumors from former neighbors that I found while shopping or taking the bus in my old neighborhood. Some told me that Henry and Camille seemed overwhelmed. After all, supporting an unemployed son-in-law with a child on the way was not an easy task. Others commented that Isabella was constantly asking my parents for money for medical expenses and that the fights at home were constant. However, no one ever mentioned that they asked about me, not even once. Even so, over time, life smiled on me a little more. I got a promotion at the dealership, moving from the assembly line to the final inspection and adjustment section, which involved a better salary. Thanks to this, my savings grew. Before turning 25, I already had a modest sum that allowed me to contemplate something unthinkable until a few years ago, buying my own car. Perhaps for many people, that's not a big deal, but for me it represented a gigantic change. I remember the emotion of entering an auction of used cars and, after several attempts, driving away with a medium sedan. It was a second-hand vehicle, not very flashy, but it was mine. With my own car, my job options expanded. I began to collaborate with a couple of colleagues who did freelance mechanical work on weekends. I dedicated myself to tuning old motorcycles, collectors' vehicles, or sometimes offering maintenance services at a client's home. That extra money came in handy to continue feeding my savings account. It was then when a stroke of luck arose. One of my former schoolmates, Nicholas, contacted me. He had gotten into the business of imported auto parts and needed someone trustworthy to oversee the mechanical part and the compatibility of certain parts with American models. "Daniel, you who have worked in workshops and dealerships would be perfect," he told me. After meditating on it, I accepted. So I spent another couple of years navigating between 2 jobs and studying online everything that could serve me: advanced mechanics courses, business administration, and some basic accounting. I led a solitary life with few real friends because the experience of my adolescence had made me distrust people in general. I had no news from my family. I only knew very occasionally that Logan and Isabella had problems paying the bills, and that my parents continued to cover most of the expenses. It was almost when I turned 27 that the event that triggered everything that would come next occurred. Nicholas decided to sell his house to move to Texas and expand his auto parts business. The house was not very large, but it was in a good neighborhood with 3 bedrooms, a small patio, and a decent garage. The real estate market was turbulent, and Nicholas was in a hurry to close the sale. First, he offered it at a standard price, but the urgency pushed him to lower it significantly, and to my surprise, he offered it to me before openly publishing it. "If you give me a reasonable down payment and commit to paying the rest in a prudent term, it's yours," he told me. It was as if someone had hit me with a mallet of reality. Buying a house, thinking about it, caused me vertigo, but I had been saving for years, and with the good salary I earned, I could dare to. We signed the papers in record time, and suddenly I had the key to a place I could call home. The first time I entered that completely empty house, I knelt down and felt a mixture of joy and nostalgia. Joy because this was my greatest achievement. Nostalgia because I remembered the 16-year-old boy who begged for a place on the sofa of his own house and was denied it. Now I had a living room and 3 bedrooms. I wondered if one day, if there were children in my future, I would give them the love that I never received. When I finished settling in, I uploaded a couple of photos to my Facebook account, which I hardly used, and said goodbye to my small studio. Everything seemed to be going well until one morning the doorbell of my new house rang. When I opened the door, I was frozen to see my parents and my sister accompanied by a couple of children I didn't know. My father, with his now more aged appearance, said to me in a soft voice, "Hello, son, long time no see. Aren't you going to invite us in?" No one showed any trace of shame or repentance, as if the past had not happened. I had no idea of the chaos that this unexpected visit was going to unleash. Almost 12 years had passed since I last saw my parents and my sister in person. In that lapse, there was only the odd text message or rumors through acquaintances, but never a real approach. And now Henry, my father, Camille, my mother, and Isabella, my sister, were standing in front of my door as if nothing had happened. With them were 2 children, approximately 10 years old. I learned later that they were my nephews, and a third, who, from the way Isabella rubbed her belly, was on the way. In the back peeked a guy whom I deduced was Logan, the very boyfriend, now husband, who caused so much trouble in my adolescence. I was astonished, not only by the fact of seeing them there, but by the naturalness with which they intended to enter my house. My father, Henry, let out a nervous laugh and tried to hug me, but I took a step back. My mother, Camille, shook her head with feigned sadness. "Are you going to receive us like this after all this time, Daniel?" Even with all the rage that it generated in me to see them again, a part of me felt curiosity to know what they wanted. Repentance? Forgiveness? Money? Or maybe something more convoluted. I told them to come in more to avoid a spectacle with the neighbors than out of a real desire for hospitality. My living room was still somewhat empty. I hadn't had time to buy all the furniture, so everyone took a chair or a place on the floor as they could. Isabella posed as if she were inspecting her future kingdom. She stood up and walked through the hallway, peering into the rooms. She didn't even bother to ask my permission. It seemed that she was trying to measure the dimensions of each room. I remembered with a pang in my chest how she used to treat my space when we lived under the same roof, something that could be discarded at any moment. "I see you're doing well," Henry said suddenly, breaking the awkwardness. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, more marked wrinkles, and a tired voice. "Look, son, we don't know where to start. We've had hard times." Many answers full of resentment passed through my mind, but I restrained myself, breathing deeply. I managed to ask calmly, "And to what do I owe this reunion, Dad? You haven't called me in years, not even when I turned 18 or 21, or to know if I was still alive." Camille tried to approach me with a gesture of pity. "Daniel, please, we were a family, even if things sometimes got complicated. Don't you think it's time to leave the past behind?" "Family," I blurted out with sarcasm. "The same family that kicked me out into the street when I turned 16 to make room for Logan?" Right at that moment, Logan cleared his throat, trying to go unnoticed. He was wearing worn clothes and had a grown beard. He didn't even remotely resemble the interesting young man he was in his youth. "Hey, kid, don't take this personal. You know that the situation was difficult back then. We all made decisions." I was about to scream at him, but Isabella's voice interrupted me. Stop blaming Daniel. You know very well that this was something that sooner or later was going to happen. We formed a family, and we needed space. It was my fault that my parents decided to relocate. It was the most logical thing. You were the one who was in the way and didn't contribute anything. That phrase made my blood boil once more. Her total lack of empathy came to light without concealment. I decided not to focus on her verbal aggression, but on the real reason for her visit. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to explain why they were there. Daniel, son, my father dared to say. You see, the house we live in is very small, and we are having difficulties. Isabella already has 2 children, one of whom spends the time sleeping on an old sofa, and now the third one is coming. Your mother and I also need some space to rest. My blood pressure is through the roof, and well, we've thought that maybe we could all live here with you. What do you mean, all? I asked incredulously. You mean you, Mom, Isabella, Logan, and the children? That's right, Camille intervened. Look, it wouldn't have to be permanent. Maybe until things stabilize a bit. Your father and I would like a room of our own. And your sister, well, you see her, she can hardly handle so much burden. The brazenness of the proposal was such that I was speechless for several seconds. I watched Isabella, who was pacing from one side to the other, suspiciously looking at my modest sofa, the kitchen without finishing furnishing, my table. I felt that in her head, she was already assigning who would stay in each room, even before I could pronounce myself about it. How could you even think that I would accept something like that? I managed to articulate at last. You left me adrift. I was left without finishing school, without food, without anything. I had to live in a garage, then in small rooms of ill repute. Seriously, do you have the nerve to come and demand that I host you now? My father flashed a grimace of annoyance as if he didn't understand why I was resisting. You were very young, son, and you didn't know how things were going. We did. Maybe we weren't the best parents, but that doesn't mean you should hold a grudge against us forever. Besides, my mother added, we're talking about your sister. You and she were born on the same day. Do you remember what I used to tell you? That thanks to her you came into this world? And now that you see her in trouble, you're not going to lend her a hand. That emotional blackmail churned my stomach. For a moment, I remembered the nights I spent cold, begging God not to get sick because I didn't have the money to pay a doctor, and all because they needed space for Logan, for their wonderful daughter, Isabella the Pampered. Now, in appearance, all of them clashed with the reality that living together in that old rented house was not sustainable, especially with the arrival of more children. It was evident that they intended to transfer that problem to my roof. I raised my voice, containing the trembling that fury and memories caused me. No, I said firmly. None of you are going to stay here. This house is the fruit of years of work, of my sleepless nights, of my savings. No one came to help me when I slept on the street. No one offered a penny so that I could finish school. No one ever asked me if I needed a plate of food. So no, they are not going to enter here. Logan put on an offended face as if my refusal was something illogical. Come on, Daniel, what do you gain by being so resentful? You're single, childless, with several empty rooms. We have a family to maintain. Stop thinking only of yourself. It cost me not to give him a punch, but I stood firm, staring at him. I'll stop thinking only of myself the day you recognize all the damage you did. If you think I'm going to open the doors to you just because it's logical or because you're frustrated, you're very wrong. Isabella, with a tantrum worthy of the teenager she was, began to raise her voice. You're still the same selfish person as always. What did it cost you to leave us a couple of rooms? How big this house is. You won't even use it completely. That bedroom with its own bathroom and the balcony would be good for me. See, your nephews could settle in the other room. You can sleep in the spare one, or if you want, even on a mattress in the living room. I don't understand your problem. Those words tore a sigh full of irony and weariness from me. Isabella's incredible ability to believe herself the owner of everything was almost comical if it weren't so hurtful. My problem, I repeated calmly, is that this house is mine, and if you don't leave now, I'm going to call the police. The police, my mother exclaimed. Would you do something like that against your own family? The only family I had, I replied, was the one that kicked me out into the street without a second thought. So if you don't want to leave willingly, I'll do it by force. My father stood up, hitting the chair with the. For a second, I feared that he was going to push me, as he used to do when he lost his temper in the past, but he restrained himself. In his place, he clenched his jaw and headed for the door with brisk steps. Camille and Isabella followed him, not without throwing looks of resentment. Logan lagged behind, muttering something unintelligible, and then he also left, dragging the frightened children with him. I closed the door and stood there leaning against it, almost breathless. It had been the most uncomfortable, tense, and furious conversation of my life, but at the same time, I was invaded by a strange sensation of power and relief. No one would ever treat me as a hindrance in my own home again. Finally, after so many years, I had been able to set a clear limit to those people who always saw me as a mere obstacle. However, the story didn't end there. The next day, my mother came back to look for me to insist once more, and then even more turbid events would occur, but I was no longer the defenseless teenager who huddled in a garage. Now, at 28 years old, I had resources to face those who intended to snatch away what it cost me blood, sweat, and tears to obtain. After that first confrontation in my living room, I thought, perhaps with too much naivety, that things would calm down and that my family would disappear from my life, at least for a good time. However, barely a week passed before my parents reappeared at my door. This time they arrived without Isabella, but with an even more insistent tone than the last time. I peeked through the window and saw Camille and Henry standing on the sidewalk, discussing something between them. Noticing my silhouette, my mother raised her hand in a gesture that seemed to me a mixture of supplication and exasperation. I hesitated for a moment, but I ended up opening the door to prevent them from putting on a bigger scandal in front of my neighbors. "What do you want now?" I asked with brusqueness. "Please, Daniel, at least listen to us for a minute," my mother said with a threat of voice. "We're not here to talk about your sister. We've come because we need your help." I sighed and crossed my arms, blocking the entrance to make it clear that I didn't intend to invite them in. My father, with his tired countenance, took the floor. "Look, I know that last time things didn't end well, but your mother and I are older, Daniel. We don't have the health we used to. My blood pressure is fatal, and the house where we live is practically collapsing. The rent is a problem, the structure is full of leaks, and your nephews, well, you know how your sister is with the children." I felt a lump in my throat. It was true that in some corner of my heart I felt sorry to see my parents deteriorated, but I also remembered with equal clarity the day they kicked me out without the slightest reservation. I thought of the cold nights I spent in a garage and the stuffiness I suffered during the hottest summers without money or a safe roof. It was difficult to sympathize when they hadn't even been interested in my survival for 12 years. "I don't understand what you intend now. Do you want me to support you, to take care of you?" My voice sounded sharper than I intended. "And then what? Do you plan to leave the house to Isabella so that she can continue with her life full of children and problems while you settle here at your leisure?" My mother shook her head, sobbing a little. "You don't understand, Daniel. We're desperate. Your sister has practically filled the house with children. Logan doesn't collaborate. He's out of work again, and your father has little to retire, but it won't be enough. I beg you, if you don't want Isabella to move here, at least let us stay." I remained silent for an instant. The question that came to my mind was obvious. And what will happen to the house you rent now? The answer was also obvious. They would leave it to Isabella and Logan. It was the same plan that they had raised more directly the week before, getting rid of the problem of my sister, transferring it to my parents, or vice versa, so that in the end they would continue to have their parasitic dynamic. "So the idea is that Isabella and Logan stay with that ruinous place, and you come here with me?" I summarized with a listless tone. "Exactly. In return, Isabella could pay you a little rent, and perhaps that way you could cover the mortgage of this house faster." My father's voice sounded optimistic, as if he were offering me around business. "I don't need or want Isabella's money," I replied with acrimony. "And I don't want you to live here either. I don't know where you get the nerve to propose it even." I could see the frustration on their faces. My mother, with a trembling voice, tried another approach. "Son, I know we weren't the best parents, but family is family. You wouldn't want to stay alone in this big house. How long do you think you can maintain it without a partner or children? We, on the other hand, would help you in whatever we could, with the cleaning, the kitchen, whatever you need. Do you want to become a bitter old man, resentful of your own blood?" Those last words pierced deep, because it was exactly the type of emotional manipulation that I had hated so much as a young man. I closed my eyes, recalled the cold winter nights, my stolen adolescence, my birthdays spent in solitude, and blurted out, "I'll be whatever, but I won't risk reliving the hell of my childhood in my own house." There was no family when I slept in a friend's garage, nor when I scratched for coins to eat a sandwich. There were no calls, no visits, no "I'm sorry, are you okay? So I don't want to hear you talk about family now." My father wanted to retort something, but I anticipated him. "I want you to leave. It's clear. Leave and don't bother me with your petitions again. This time I'm not asking, but demanding." My mother whimpered a little more, trying to evoke pity, but none of that moved me enough. A chill ran down my spine. The mixture of sorrow and rage was unbearable to me. I opened the door vehemently. Henry and Camille retreated reluctantly, throwing me glances between sad and resentful. I stood there watching them walk away while a part of me was torn between guilt and relief. Guilt because I still found it hard to believe that I was dismissing my parents in that way. Relief because putting a stop to them reaffirmed the independence that it had cost me so much effort. But that peace lasted very little. A couple of days later, a neighbor, an elderly gentleman Charles, who lived around the corner, called me at work to tell me that a pregnant woman, a bearded man, and a teenager were prowling around my house. On hearing that description, I knew immediately that it was Isabella, Logan, and one of my nephews. Charles said that they seemed to be looking for a way to enter through the backyard or something similar. He asked me to return as soon as possible because he feared that it was a burglary. My heart raced. Without thinking twice, I asked for permission at work and ran to my car to get home. As I approached, my blood boiled. I couldn't believe they had the nerve to try to force their entry. To my surprise and horror, I found the kitchen window broken and the lock of the back door tampered with. My adrenaline exploded to the maximum. They were inside. Isabella, Logan, and the eldest son of both, a boy of 10 or 11 years old, had broken in. When I crossed the door, my sister spat at me. "You don't leave us an option. Your parents have put pressure on us. If you don't help us, who will? Living in misery is not something we are willing to accept. This house is almost empty. What does it cost you to let us stay in the big room?" Logan let out a mocking laugh, lying on one of my kitchen chairs. "It was about time you showed up, brother-in-law. Don't look at us like that. In the end, we are in our right to look for a roof. If you don't want to understand it, then too bad." I almost lost control. I pounced on Logan and grabbed him by the shirt. We both screamed. The frightened boy threw a bottle in an attempt to defend his father, and in the fray, I cut myself with a piece of glass that was on the floor. Charles, my neighbor, had called the police. On hearing the screams, in a matter of minutes, several patrols parked in front of my house. Although Isabella wanted to deny the obvious, my neighbor explained to the officers that he saw them prowling and breaking the window. One officer inspected the place and confirmed the damages. They took my statement and Charles's. I was categorical. I denounced them for trespassing. They are my sister and my brother-in-law, but they entered without my consent and have assaulted me. The officer, without many detours, proceeded to arrest Logan and took Isabella's data. My sister hurled insults, crying and saying that they only needed a place to sleep, but it was useless. The teenager was also taken aside to check if he had committed any aggression or additional breakage. With my hand bloody and bandaged, I had to sign the report. It pained me to see that child caught in this chaos, victim of the irresponsibility of his parents, but I could not stand idly by. I called a friend who worked in a hardware store to help me fix the window and change the lock. Meanwhile, I felt a knot in my stomach imagining the reaction of my parents. This was no longer a simple family fight. It was a criminal act with legal consequences. They could declare what they wanted, but the evidence played in my favor. The tools with which they forced the lock were there, and I also had Charles's testimony. That same night, I understood that my family would not stop easily. The idea of putting surveillance cameras or reinforcing security roamed in my head. At 28 years old, I never thought that I would have to defend my house as if it were a bunker, and even less from my own sister and my parents. But the facts were increasingly disturbing. They were capable of anything to get away with it. However, I did not intend to yield. I had come too far and suffered too much to let them destroy the peace and stability that it cost me so much to build. Story 2. My family always favored my perfect brother and disinherited me for starting my business. Now my bakery is a success, my brother lost his job, and my parents want me to employ him. I am 32 years old, and my life took a radical turn a few years ago. I am from a small town in central Texas where everyone knows you, and I always felt that my parents put my older brother on a pedestal, ignoring my own achievements. Since childhood, he was the perfect child in their eyes. He excelled in school, participated in sports, and never caused trouble. Meanwhile, I always felt second best. After finishing university in Austin, where I graduated in mechanical engineering, I decided that my path would not be that of an executive in a large company. Instead, I was always fascinated by the idea of creating something of my own, something that truly reflected my passion. So, instead of looking for that coveted 9 to 5 in Dallas or Houston, I launched a small artisanal bakery in my hometown, something that I had dreamed of since childhood because of the love for baking that my grandparents instilled in me. When I told my parents my intention to open a bakery, I couldn't expect a reaction of support. On the contrary, their faces turned into expressions of disapproval. Another fantasy, they told me sarcastically. For them, my brother, who had landed a promising job in a Wall Street firm in New York, represented the ideal path. Why would I want to dedicate myself to something so small and risky as my own business, in which the competition was fierce? My parents did not hide their disappointment at any time. During a family dinner in Austin, in which my brother was rejoicing in his first great achievements in his company, my attempts to share my plans were met with laughter and sarcastic comments. Still, I stood firm in my decision. I was not looking for their approval. I knew that I had a dream to pursue. So, I moved to a small and rustic house in a picturesque area of the city near an old market in the center to start setting up my bakery. I bought some used ovens, put up brick walls, and began to experiment with recipes that had passed from generation to generation in my family. It was hard work, but I felt alive with each loaf I took out of the oven and with each customer who smiled when trying my creations. At first, the community was skeptical. Some said that there were already enough bakeries in the area, that my idea would not have a way out. But little by little I began to find my niche with special breads, innovative cakes, and a cozy atmosphere that attracted people. Among my clients were people from all walks of life, from young professionals who came to enjoy a coffee in the mornings to elderly people who found in my store a meeting point to share stories and laughter. While my bakery was beginning to take off, I continued to receive passive-aggressive messages from my parents, always criticizing my efforts and asking me why I was not going after a more stable job. They were not really looking to offer me help. They just wanted to remind me that I was choosing a path full of uncertainty. One day I received a call from my mother while I was closing the store at sunset. Her tone was cold and distant. She asked me how things were going, trying to probe some indication of failure to dissuade me from continuing. I could not help but feel a pang of pain when listening to her voice full of judgment. I tried to defend myself, explaining that I was doing what I loved and that, although the road was not easy, I had faith in my vision, but she did not want to listen to reason. Perhaps if you had followed the safe path that your brother took, you would not be in this situation, she said with some disdain. It hurt me deeply, but I knew that I was not going to let her negativity stop me. Throughout the following months, I lived a whirlwind of emotion. On one hand, I was happy to see that my business was beginning to take shape and gain loyal customers. On the other hand, the resentment towards my parents grew. The memories of my childhood, those small victories of my brother at the expense of my own struggles, became more intense with each disparaging comment. I remember one day in particular, a sunny Saturday in San Antonio, when a group of my regular customers stopped me on the street to congratulate me on a new product that I had launched. It was a moment of pure joy. Seeing how people were excited about my breads confirmed that, despite the criticisms, I was on the right track, and although I was pained by the lack of recognition from my family, I felt that I had a purpose and a community that supported me. Over time, my bakery became a meeting point for the community. Visitors from nearby cities and even tourists passing through our route on Highway 290 began to arrive. These visitors were delighted with the rustic charm of the place and with the authenticity of the products, and soon I gained a reputation that surpassed the borders of my small town in Texas. Meanwhile, the relationship with my parents continued to deteriorate. Each attempt on their part to re-establish contact became another opportunity for them to remind me of how much of a failure my choice of life represented. One day I received an email from my mother from her mansion in Houston, where they asked me to seriously consider returning to the safe side of life, finding a job in the city, perhaps in the same company as my brother. Everything can change if you come back home, they said in the email, filled with false concern and veiled reproaches, but I knew that that was not what I wanted. Despite their reproaches, I began to notice that something strange was happening with my brother. I no longer saw on social media the typical posts of corporate success from New York. Once a month, I would get some indirect message in which it was hinted that things at his job were not as stable as they seemed. My nostalgia for the past, where he was always the successful one, transformed into genuine concern. How was it possible that he was having problems? One summer afternoon, while adjusting a new recipe for whole wheat bread with nuts, I received an unexpected call from him. The tone on the line sounded nervous and shaky. For a few minutes, I remained silent, trying to assimilate his voice on the other end of the phone. Finally, he told me that his company in New York was going through a crisis, cuts, restructurings, and that he had been one of the regrettable layoffs. He felt that all his effort and commitment had vanished overnight, leaving him aimless and without knowing what to do next. Although there was a lot of rancor for the treatment received in the past, I could not help but feel compassion. I remembered our childhood years playing in the streets of our city, sharing dreams of the future, and I felt that despite the differences and the conflicts, he was also my brother. I offered him some emotional support, suggesting that he look for opportunities that would fit his skills, although at that moment I did not think about changing my stance towards his demands or towards our parents. But I perceived the possibility that circumstances might have changed. While he was dealing with his unemployment, my parents seemed increasingly desperate for my approval. In a video call that they organized for me between the three of them, my father began to enumerate almost like a catalog all the moments in which they had made sacrifices for their family, taking care of me when I was sick, paying for my studies, and comparing them with what they perceived as a waste of my talent in the bakery. They were not only offending my decisions, but also insinuating that now that my business was going well, I was to blame for having hurt them by not following their advice. The tension was palpable in the middle of the call. In a moment of great frustration, I exploded emotionally. I told them that if they continued to use my family relationships to pressure me, there would be no tomorrow. I said goodbye abruptly and cut off the communication. Sometimes confrontation was inevitable to reaffirm my limits. In those difficult days, I continued to find solace in work. I had the opportunity to participate in a food fair in San Antonio, where I exhibited my products along with other local entrepreneurs. There I met a couple of investors who were interested in the expansion of my bakery. They offered me a partner to open a chain of stores in other cities in Texas. On the one hand, the offer was tempting and could mean a great leap in my career. On the other hand, I feared that with success would also come the temptation to reconcile with my parents to take advantage of my success, as they mentioned in their emails. After reflecting, I decided to take the opportunity. Signing agreements with these investors not only meant growing as a business, but also demonstrating to myself that my vision and dedication were capable of overcoming any obstacle. I signed the contract and focused on expanding the brand while maintaining the quality and personal touch that I had always wanted to transmit. As my bakery expanded with new branches in Houston and Dallas, I received even more messages and calls from my parents trying to get closer, mixing reproaches with supposed congratulations. It became more and more difficult to ignore them, but my focus was on my chosen family, my loyal employees, my satisfied customers, and recently my partner with whom I was building a life together. One night, after a long day of work in the new Houston branch, I received a message in which my mother said, "We always wanted the best for you, even if you didn't understand it. We hope to see you soon and that everything is okay." It took me a while to decide how to respond because her message brought mixed memories of pain and certain hope. I knew that any meeting with them was emotionally risky, but I was also curious to see if they had really changed. However, before getting to that point, other things happened, things that made me rethink my family relationship. A few days later, I entered my store in Dallas and noticed that there was a letter without a return address on the counter. I opened it with trembling hands and found a cryptic message. "Remember where you come from. Don't forget your family when everything is easy for you." No one knew where that message came from, but it made me reflect on the tension that continued to exist, the internal battle between my desire for forgiveness and my need to distance myself to protect my emotional well-being. My thoughts swirled. My brother, who until recently we had not spoken after that last conversation, also seemed to be dealing with his own family and professional conflict. My parents continued to insist on reconciling, but I felt that I needed more time to think. The expansion of the business absorbed a large part of my time, but it also provided me with moments of quiet reflection, evening strolls through the streets of Houston after closing the store, or simply sitting on the back porch of my house in Austin to watch how the city changed, gave me space to consider my options. Should I try one last time to contact my parents and recover some of what was lost? And how would that affect my new family and my personal future? My heart continued divided between the resentment that had accumulated for years and the possibility of healing some wounds for the sake of inner peace. However, I knew that any decision had to be based on what was best for me and for the well-being of my family and my business. Weeks passed, and the expansion of my bakery continued at a good pace. As I opened new branches in places as diverse as Austin, San Antonio, and Fort Worth, I also faced a growing personal dilemma. Should I try to reconcile with my parents and my brother, or continue protecting my inner peace? The questions haunted me in long nights behind the production line while the dough turned into fresh breads and the orders piled up on my desks. One Saturday morning, while reviewing the emails of the new investors interested in funding a store in El Paso, I received a call from an old friend from college. We had not spoken in years, but he had something interesting to tell me. During his time in Boston, he had worked in a foundation that helped entrepreneurs with family problems find counseling and thought of me when he learned of my situation. He offered me a recommendation for a family therapist who had helped many in similar cases. The idea of seeking professional help to manage these family tensions did not excite me much at first. I had always thought that I could solve it by myself. However, the suggestion resonated with me. Perhaps it was time to explore avenues that I had not considered to heal old wounds. I decided to take a trial session with the therapist in one of their offices in Houston. There, in a quiet and safe environment, I was able to open up about my feelings towards my parents and my brother. I talked about the feeling of always being second best despite my own efforts, the shame of having been rejected by my family, and the fear of what the future held if I tried to reopen old wounds. The therapist helped me to reflect on the possibility of establishing healthy boundaries, of forgiving gradually without giving up my own principles, and on the importance of my business that had built me so much. A few months later, while I was focused on the expansion of the bakery to new metropolitan areas such as El Paso and Amarillo, my brother finally contacted me again. This time he did so to invite me to visit his small apartment in Brooklyn, where he was trying to restart his life in a completely different field after losing his job in New York. During the phone call, I noticed a different tone in his voice, less arrogance, more vulnerability, and a yearning to better understand the family dynamics that had separated them. I accepted his invitation and planned to meet at a hotel halfway between Brooklyn and New York to talk without the pressure of the old family scenarios. When we saw each other, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. We sat in a cozy cafe in a corner of the city, away from curious glances and with the comfort of knowing that we could talk frankly. For hours we shared our perspectives on the family, on how we had been shaped by the expectations and sacrifices that were not always understood. I told him about my bakery, about the challenges of growing a business in times of pandemic, and how despite the disapproval of our parents, I found in the art of baking a refuge and a way to be happy. He, in turn, told me about his pain for losing his job, a feeling abandoned both by his colleagues and by the lack of closeness with our family. Although the reunion was not a miraculous healing of all the years of resentment, it was a first step to rebuild a bridge between us. We talked about the possibility of collaborating on some future project, not necessarily in the bakery, but perhaps in some family event or in some venture that could take advantage of his skills in finance, while I contributed culinary creativity. We said goodbye with a firm handshake and the promise to keep in touch without unrealistic expectations, but with a genuine desire to improve the relationship. Meanwhile, I continued to receive sporadic messages from my parents. Some days they were encouraging. "We are glad to know that you are well," or "We hope that one day we can overcome our differences." Other days, however, they were subtle reminders of how they expected that with success they would finally feel proud of me. They kept trying to fix things without really fixing things. In the meeting room of my new branch in Dallas, during a meeting to talk about the opening of a new store, I thought about how my financial and commercial decisions had been influenced indirectly by my personal situation. I had always wanted to demonstrate that despite having been disinherited from the traditional family, I could build something that really mattered not only to me, but also to the community. Every day that passed, my commitment to the bakery strengthened, and with it also my determination to heal old wounds at my own pace. I continued to attend therapy and reflect on what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with my parents. The possibility of a family meeting in the near future was ambiguous to me. On the one hand, I longed for reconciliation and forgiveness. On the other hand, I feared falling back into those cycles of emotional manipulation and favoritism that hurt me so much. Closing the store one night after the appointment with my advisors, I settled at the table in my office with a piece of freshly baked bread ready to face another day of work and important decisions. The moon shone over the Texan city, reminding me that despite the shadows of the past, there is always room for light in the future. The following months were marked by multiple advances both in my professional and personal life. The bakery that had started in a small store in my hometown had transformed into a recognized chain throughout Texas with branches in important cities and a loyal clientele. The expansion of the business not only elevated my economic success, but also reinforced my sense of identity and self-confidence. Every time I opened a new store in places like Fort Worth or El Paso, I remembered that first oven in which I had dared to dream, and it filled me with pride to see how my passion materialized in every corner of the community. In the midst of so much achievement, I never neglected the search for inner peace that I had avoided for years. Thanks to the therapy sessions and the sincere conversations with my brother, I began to better understand the weight of family wounds. I was not looking to erase the past overnight, but to accept that both my parents and I had acted under the pressure of expectations and fears that seemed insurmountable to us at that time. One spring morning, while reviewing the orders at the administrative headquarters in Austin, I received a carefully written letter. The handwriting was familiar to me. It was from my mother. It had been a long time since the last time a message from her was not full of reproaches or pleas. This letter, however, was different. With an introspective and sincere tone, she spoke to me of her own regrets, of how they had been blinded to my aspirations by continuously comparing my brothers, and of how much she longed to mend the broken relationship between us. She asked for nothing in return. She only seemed to want to share a personal reflection and perhaps plant the seed of a genuine reconciliation. While reading the letter with the sunlight entering through the window of the office in Dallas, I felt a mixture of emotions: surprise, relief, and caution. I had had many reasons to suspect that my parents could change, but I also knew that empty words do not resolve years of hurt. I decided to respond with sincerity. I told them about my progress in the bakery, how I had transformed my passion into a collective dream of the community, and I also told them of how little by little I was learning to heal and to forgive not without reservations. I let them know that the road to a healthy relationship would depend on real change and on concrete actions, not only verbal promises. The following days passed in a kind of emotional limbo. My parents began to contact me more regularly, not only to talk about me, but also to take an interest in my well-being, without judgments, congratulating me on my achievements and asking me how I managed the business. I agreed to attend a family dinner that they organized at their residence in Houston, with the idea of facing this new stage with caution and emotional preparation. The dinner was uncomfortable at first. I felt the presence of old resentments in every word, every forced silence. However, at a certain moment, while we were all sharing anecdotes around the table, my father paused, and with a voice broken with emotion admitted that they had been wrong to despise my decisions, and that I should never have felt the need to compare myself with my brother. That did not erase the past, but opened a door to the possibility of starting again with honest conversations and without false expectations. My brother, for his part, continued returning to our contact sporadically after having spoken with the family in his own terms in Brooklyn. He had also begun to attend therapy, trying to resolve his feelings of abandonment and guilt. Although we were not yet the perfect team, we both knew that our lives had changed too much to discard the opportunity to improve the fraternal relationship. Over time, the family began to find a new balance. It was not a quick or easy process. There were relapses, days of tension, moments of discomfort, but also days of shared laughter and small gestures of sincere affection. At the bakery, my employees noticed a change in me. I no longer carried the bitterness of years of family disdain, but radiated a tranquility and security that inspired everyone around me. Despite the fact that my parents never became perfect or stopped making mistakes, I learned to put into practice what I had learned in therapy to establish healthy boundaries and to forgive not for them, but for my own mental peace. The success of my business did not make me forget my roots or my dreams, but it did teach me that being happy did not depend on the approval of others. The complete reconciliation with my family was not the main objective, but I did manage to repair, even if only a little, the relationships that had been so harmful. My brother and I found a common ground in which we could collaborate and support each other without reliving the past. With my parents, I opted for a more distant relationship based on respect and courtesy, always taking care not to sacrifice my emotional well-being. Story 3. My mom and brother tried to get rid of the old grouch after my dad died, but she chose me to inherit the family business instead of them. Now they are furious and begging me to help them. Hi, I'm Mia, 17F, and this is the story I never thought I would have to tell. I grew up in Glendale, Arizona, and although it's a quiet place, my life took a huge turn when my dad, Lucas, passed away. It all happened a few months ago, and although we partly expected it because of his illness, nothing really prepares you for losing someone so important. Now I live with my grandmother, Evelyn, 70 years old, who my mom, Charlotte, and my brother, Wyatt, practically called the old grouch behind her back. I never understood why they treated her like that, but anyway, here's everything that has happened. My dad, Lucas, was a man very loved by everyone. He had a noble character and an immense capacity to make anyone feel at home. He worked in a climate control services company. However, what he really loved was designing and repairing air conditioning and heating systems for small family businesses. He believed that small communities like Glendale needed that support to prosper. Due to his efforts, he ended up opening, with the support of my grandmother, although it sounds ironic, a small chain of restaurants and cafeterias specializing in homemade desserts. It sounds strange that someone so expert in the technical part ventured into this type of business, but that's how Dad was. He took risks when something passionate him. My grandmother, Evelyn, was one of the great architects of all that. She had previous experience in the world of cooking, especially in baking. When my grandfather passed away years ago, she inherited a property near the center of Glendale and turned it into her first location. Little by little, with the help of my father and a distant uncle who may rest in peace, the business grew. Liam's Kitchen and Bakery is what the chain is called. A curious name, right? Liam was the name of one of my great-grandfathers, one of those pioneers who came from afar looking for new opportunities. Dad always liked to honor the family legacy. My mother, Charlotte, however, never got involved 100% in all this. She works in a local bank, has studies in finance, and I was always impressed by the way she could handle numbers and accounts. She had at first glance all the necessary traits to be an excellent administrator of the family business. But for some reason that I never fully understood, she seemed to detest my grandmother Evelyn. During childhood, I noticed their friction and those silent discussions every time they saw each other. The strange thing is that my grandmother treated her with courtesy and with a strange halo of patience, as if she and my mother had a long history that we did not know. For his part, my brother, Wyatt, 19M, is practically the mini version of my mom. They say that children tend to imitate their parents, but in his case, it's exaggerated. He repeats each of my mother's opinions and always takes her side, even if he doesn't know the reason behind it. When my dad became seriously ill, he had to leave the daily administration of Liam's Kitchen and Bakery in the hands of my grandmother and a manager they hired years ago called Antoine. He knows the operational part very well, but he is still an employee, and my grandmother continued to be the mastermind. Even so, Dad wanted that when Wyatt finished his studies or when I grew up a little more, one of the two would take charge of the chain. He always told me that he wanted us to continue the legacy, that the dream that began with my great-grandfather Liam and that continued with the homemade recipe of my grandmother Evelyn would never disappear. For my mother, on the other hand, all that project was not worth it. She kept saying that it was an outdated business and that my grandmother wanted to stay in control of everything with her methods of the last century. The truth is that during the worst stage of Dad's illness, I didn't have the head to think about what was happening at the business level. I just wanted to be with him and help him as much as I could. Wyatt, for his part, went to study in another city, not far away in Flagstaff, and came to visit from time to time. When finally what we feared so much happened and Dad passed away, everything was chaos. The funeral was in Glendale, and during the family reunion I noticed that my mother and Wyatt spoke barely the minimum with my grandmother. I, on the other hand, felt the need to be with her because we knew that losing a son was something that destroyed her inside, even if she didn't show it publicly. After the burial, everyone dispersed, and I realized that my mother never visited my grandmother again, not even to see how she was dealing with her pain. Wyatt neither. When I tried to talk to my mom about that, her response was that the old grouch should solve her own problems. We no longer have reasons to continue feigning interest. That phrase marked me. Why did she feel so much animosity towards her? My grandmother Evelyn is not perfect, but she always treated us well, or at least me. I have spent weekends by her side learning a little of her baking wisdom and even receiving advice on how to deal with the pain for the death of Dad. She offered me empathy and affection. While at home, I found 2 cold statues that barely seemed affected. In the middle of all this, my grandmother proposed that I continue visiting her. It was something that I felt born to do because I didn't want her to be left alone. I want to clarify that I didn't do it expecting anything in return. I really love her, and losing Dad united us even more. On those visits, I discovered that I liked the atmosphere of the bakery, seeing how the staff coordinated, how new recipes were designed, and especially how my grandmother managed the administrative part. My aspirations to go to a good university were reinforced. I have the illusion of studying something related to administration and business, perhaps at the State University of Arizona, or if I have the opportunity, in some further away in California. I didn't have it very clear yet. What was very clear to me was that my mother and Wyatt were growing further and further away, not only from the memory of my dad, but from my grandmother and everything that she meant. I knew that something big was going to happen because my grandmother is not one of those who stand idly by, and one way or another, sooner or later she was going to decide the course of Liam's kitchen and bakery. The great surprise came one Saturday afternoon after one of my routine meetings with grandmother Evelyn at her house. It was a typical mid-century style house of Glendale with that classic architecture of the suburbs of Arizona and surrounded by a garden with shrubs and an enormous cactus that my great-grandfather Liam planted decades ago. I had already spent several weekends helping her organize papers and reviewing old documents of the bakery while she taught me the accounts and told me stories about how the business arose. That Saturday, my grandmother had asked me to please try to convince my mom and Wyatt to come spend the day with us. I want to talk with everyone, she told me with a tone of urgency that I had not known before. I knew instantly that it was something serious. I went home with the intention of persuading them. The problem was that none of them wanted to even hear the word grandma. My mom was sitting in the living room with her cell phone in hand, reviewing emails from the bank and credit cards of client. Wyatt, meanwhile, was watching a television program without paying much attention to me. I don't think to lose the time going to the house of that woman. It was the first and only phrase that came from the mouth of Mom, accompanied by a gesture of disgust. Wyatt limited to shrug his shoulders and to support. Less now that Lucas already is not there. She added, as if the presence of Dad had been the only reason to maintain any relationship with me. I tried to remain calm, and I told them that please they listened at least the proposal of Evelyn. I reminded them that she continued being a part of the family, that Dad would have felt fatal seeing us so distant, and that he in life always wanted that. We don't have reasons to feign more. I felt hurt. It didn't have sensed this hostility. The grandmother never had done them any snub, or at least I didn't have constance of it. Even so, I couldn't avoid asking them to reconsider, and if the invitation was important. I received the same dry response of always. When I spoke with Wyatt in private, he said something similar to, "I do not crave to deal with dramas, Mia, leave me in peace." With that, the impotence invaded me. Everything was going so well when Dad was here. But without more, I had to assume the negative of both, and to direct me alone to the house of the grandmother. To my surprise, she received me with a semblance between serious and resigned. She commented to me that she expected it. "I know to your mom and how stubborn they can be," she and Wyatt. She was sad, but not surprised. Then she asked me to sit down at the kitchen table, that where we used to chat, with a coffee freshly made and butter cookies. "Mia, I have something very important to tell you." she said to me with a firm temper that made me lend the 100% of my attention. These months have been very hard for all, and even more for me after losing my son, Lucas. She looked at me with a mixture of melancholy and affection. I felt a knot in the throat. To speak of Dad always removed me inside. Your father and I had plans for this business, she continued. Liam's Kitchen and Bakery is part of our family from does years. When your father was sick, he had in mind a plan that one of you, Wyatt or you, be involved each time more. But after seeing the attitude of Wyatt and on all that of your mom, I understand that none of you is interested. To me almost goes out me the tears. I felt shame alien for the way in that my mom and Wyatt had behaved with her. At the same time, I felt anger and incomprehension. That is why I want to leave the business in hands of someone that yes care indeed. She continued, you are very young still, I know, but I see in you the spark of your father. Those win of learn and of take forward our legacy. The phrase took me completely unprepared. I never considered the possibility of inherit I alone the business. I had barely 17 years. I even had not begun the university. Although it fascinated me all what saw in the bakery, I doubted of my capacities. Would you like Mia? Would you form you to continue with what your father and I began? She asked, almost with timidity, as if fearing my response. My heart palpitated with strength. It was as if the pieces fit. My dream to study businesses, the promise to Dad to take care of the grandmother, my respect and admiration for Liam's Kitchen and Bakery. It was an offer that flattered me and terrified me to equal parts, but in the bottom I felt that that was a call opportunity to honor to my father and to follow with something that he so loved. Yes, I whispered with a knot in the throat. I would love to learn. I want to do it by Dad, by us. The grandmother smiled me with tenderness and embraced me. That moment felt like an aid after so many months of anxiety and pain, but also it assaulted me the conscience that I was going to face tempests. How would react my mother and Wyatt to the know that by his scorn and distance had remained out of the succession of the family business? My grandmother, with the voice more calmed, explained to me that during the next years, it would continue managing the company beside Antoine the manager, and that would be training me from simple things until the big takes of decisions. Also, she cleared me that if it needed help with the university registration or with the expenses of housing, she would take charge because it considered that it was his duty to impel my formation and that that would be the best way to ensure a solid future for the business. Everything seemed perfect, but the peace wouldn't last. When I returned to house the Sunday in the night, it had a mixture of emotion and fear. My mom and Wyatt were in the room, as always, she with his portable computer and he with the remote control of the television. I began to count them all, probably with too much sincerity. I wanted that they gave account that they same had rejected the offer and had won the indifference of the grandmother. It did not do it with intention to presume. What it wished was to show them that if it had been a bit more empathetic, the life would have taken another course. But what followed was a chaos. My mom at the beginning laughed with scorn, convinced that I was inventing the history only to provoke it. Then, to see that I was not joking, it raged and released a retail of insults to my grandmother and to me, accusing me of conspire to remain me with the business. Wyatt seconded it without repair. I told them that perhaps they had been mistaken to ignore the invitation of the grandmother, that their attitude during years had been hurtful, and that this was a logical consequence. I received a descommunal scolding. You are an egoist, little girl, my mom shouted. During the night the discussions did not cease. The tension was so heavy that hardly could sleep. It resulted me very painful to see how they accused me of opportunist when knew with spare that the person that always looked for his own benefit was my mom, and my mind resonated his words when said that it did not have reasons to see to the grandmother now that Dad was not. And in spite of that, it was I the bad of the film. To the day following it exploded the true scandal. Charlotte and Wyatt presented in the house of the grandmother without warning, begging him that it reconsidered. They arrived with flowers, excuses, and gestures of remorse that were so false that noticed to kilometers of distance. And there Evelyn, my calm and always patient grandmother, lost the patience. I do not need more shams, said them with a calm tense. If it mattered you, indeed the family would have come before. Now already I know what you feel in the bottom. I am not arranged to give second opportunities when neither can ask pardon, genuinement by his scorn. I remain near, observing everything. Wyatt kept silent with the head down, perhaps overwhelmed by the reprimand. My mom in change insisted in that had misunderstood his words, that she did not know the important, that it was the meeting But the certain is that while it spoke, each syllable left see that his interest was only by the business, no by the family relation. The grandmother did not doubt in cutting the discussion. It raised the hand in sign of enough and asked them that they left. Charlotte followed, trying to defend himself, but Evelyn was forceful. Do not go back here to beg something that never wanted of respect. It was a symbolic crash that resonated in my mind. I felt me between proud to see to my grandmother so firm and terrified by the repercussions that would have in our familiar dynamic. At the end of the day, my mom and Wyatt abandoned the house furious, and I remained there contemplating to the grandmother with a mixture of sadness, gratitude, on all a new conviction. From this instant my life would change radically. It would continue living with Evelyn, would learn all the necessary on the business, and of some way would have that break with the I gave that gave me the house and that grew. A decision that would not be easy, but that in the bottom resonated as the most correct to honor the memory of Dad and to walk to my own independence. I remained several days in house of the grandmother Evelyn after that occurred. It was as if the walls breathed a bit more quiet without the tension of my mom and my brother around. With each minute that happened, it did me more conscious of that my relation with them, as the new, was changing of form irreparable. By a side felt guilt because it wished that all could resolve our differences. But by another remembered his words and the lack of respect that had showed to my grandmother during so much time, and this confirmed me that the situation did not have an easy solution. In the days following, I devoted me to help to Evelyn to organize the paperwork of the bakery, even visited one of the locals of Liam's kitchen and bakery, that where my father Lucas used to happen, more time reviewing that all functioned correctly in the kitchen and charlando with the employees as if they were of the family. When I went in, I experienced a mixture of nostalgia and joy. It all had changed a lot. Still, they were the murals full of historical anecdotes of Glendale, the showcases with desserts and homemade cookies, and the tables of wood with metallic chairs that my dad sent to manufacture in a local workshop. I felt a special link with this place. Antoine, the manager that had supported to my grandmother from the start of the illness of Dad, received me with a smile and presented me formally to the rest of the team. I suppose that many had intuited something because they knew of the relation near that it had with the grandmother. But when Antoine said that I would be learning the administrative and logistics part, remained me seeing with complicity, as if he also trusted in the plan of the grandmother Evelyn. It had a shine in the eyes that transmitted optimism, what helped me to relax me a bit. Until this moment, I continued doubting of my own capacities, but see the heat and the support of who worked there animated me to believe in me. Clear all was not color of rose. As soon as I sat down with the laptop and the registrations of sales gave me account that it had a lot of work to put me to the day. It was learning on posting of products, management of providers, and until reviewing some subjects of marketing local. Being sincere, felt a bit of vertigo. It had barely 17 years. I had not finished my last course of preparatoria and already saw me submerged in numbers and contracts. At nights, the grandmother supervised me, patiently correcting my errors and explaining me the details that escaped me. Gave me account of what passionate was by all what involved Liam's kitchen and bakery, the love by the baking, the taste by attend to the people of the neighborhood, and a philosophy day of work based in the honesty and the nearness. While advanced the days, my mom Charlotte sent me text messages, each so much the majority in a tone passive-aggressive, saying me that it was betraying it, and that it was an ingrate for preferring to remain me with the grandmother in place of go back to house for, if out little. My brother Wyatt sent a long email accusing me to have orchestrated everything to remain me with the family business, alleging that I knew from before that the grandmother had invited us to announce something important. Nothing more far of the reality. Never imagined me what Evelyn planned until that had occurred. But neither my mom, neither Wyatt were arranged to believe it. They needed to blame to someone. It seemed me ironic that of prompt if they showed so much interest in the bakery, when until does nothing called it an obsolete project. Tacoma one afternoon in that found me reviewing papers in the kitchen with the grandmother, received a notification of a familiar distant my great-aunt Grace that lives in Texas asking me explanations on a post sufficiently disagreeable that found in social networks. Who had written it? Then my brother, supposedly with the vein of my mom, basically counted his own version of the history, painting himself as victims of a treachery and ensuring that my grandmother and I had hatched a plan to remain us with the chain. According to him, we had cheated to Charlotte and to guide concealing it reason of the invitation. To read this was as receive a punch in the stomach. It boiled me the blood of the rage because it not only were lies, but what did it public in social networks, exhibiting a familiar drama that seemed me unnecessary. My grandmother read the text in my cellular and simply sighed, carrying the hand to the front. Daughter, do not concern you, who know you knows the truth. Do not rebakes his to his game. However, it had something in his look that evidenced his sadness at the end of the account. Wyatt and Charlotte continued being his family, although treated her so bad. Even so wanted to defend me. It proposed me write a message refuting his arguments, clearing the reality of the things, but trembled me the hands, and the words entangling me in the head. Evelyn detained me kindly, suggesting him sometime decided call by telephone to Gwack to speak it directly. No longer wanted to follow this war of publications and internet. When answered me hardly left me say hello before beginning to shout and to blame me of everything. I tried to remain calmed. I explained him that never had knowledge of the plans of the grandmother, that all had been improvised, and that I simply accepted because I wished to continue the legacy of Dad. But my brother did not listen. His rage and resentment were too big. It accused me of lying, said that never imported me the family, and that hopefully the grandmother opened the eyes before committing what he considered the error of his life. It hung me without giving me opportunity to answer. Sober say that felt me fatal. I closed the eyes with strength, trying to contain the tears. The grandmother approached and embraced me, remembering me that the family to times can be the source more big of pain, and that surely my father no would want to see me suffer. She animated me to follow forward, to focus me in my goals, and to not envenom me with the bitterness that Charlotte and Wyatt were projecting. It said me that the best that could do was show with facts that the bakery and the family legacy valued the penalty, and that could carry them to a solid future. This same night decided me to remain definitely with my grandmother. I packed and asked to a cousin Hudson that accompanied me to the house of my mom to collect the rest, did not want face me to Charlotte or Wyatt in this moment. My grandmother recommended me do not do it only. When I arrived, anybody went out to salute. The found in the room, seeing the Tella. I greeted them with a threat of voice. I said them that came by my belongings because would remain me indefinitely with Evelyn. They did not respond. His silence felt like an impenetrable wall. I took my suitcases. I put my notes of the school and a pair of memories of Dad that did not want leave back. Just when was about to go out by the main door saw of Ryojo as my mom observed us with a look inexpressive, almost of stone. No pronounced neither a word. What neither rose. I went out and did not look back. That night, while saved my clothes in the closet of the room of invited and house of the grandmother, felt that went into a stage completely new of my life, full of uncertainty, but with the certainty that could not follow, living with people that no respected neither my decisions neither to the grandmother that so want. Now began of truth the traverse of turn me in the heiress of jams, kitchen, and bakery, assuming a weight enormous in my shoulders, and with a pain deep in the heart, by the distancing with my own mom and brother. Took already a week living with my grandmother Evelyn when arrived the news that would change the course of my immediate future, had been accepted in the program of administration of companies of the University State of Arizona, had sent my application months back almost without hopes, and in the middle of the morning by the game of my father Lucas. But when opened the mail and read the word congratulations, felt that all my world lit up. It shouted so strong that think that the half of Glendale could listen me. Grandmother, I achieve it, exclaimed agitated while went down the stairs of the house with my laptop in hand. They went and me accepted. Knew that would achieve it, Mia. Answered with a smile proud. Your father would have been so happy to see you follow your dreams. It was a moment very special, one that in other circumstances would have shared immediately with my mom Charlotte and with Wyatt. But now the familiar situation followed the same of tense, or if fits even more. I thought and call them and count them the good new, believing ingenuously that perhaps this would break a bit the ice and would do them feel proud of me. However, my grandmother recommended me prudence. If you decide count them, do it without expect applauses, warn me with sweetness. She was right. After all the attacks and defamations, did not expect a sudden change of attitude for Calmo. To the day following arrived me another bombardment of messages of my mom, apparently had on tier of my acceptance in the university, thanks to a publication that did in networks for my friends. In place of a congratulation, received a cumulus of reproaches. Goes to study businesses only to remain you with all what is of your father? Think that you are better that Wyatt, and that I ridiculous? Continue being a girl that does not know it all of the life. I read it several times, feeling each word as a direct hit to the chest. I asked me in what moment my own mom had arrived to hate me so much. Quiz answer with calm argue that I did not pretend compete with anybody, that all was doing it by dad and by the family legacy. But to the end contained me remembering the lesson that the grandmother Evelyn had taught me to times the silence is the best answer. Even so, something inside of me asked a resolution, have them blocked did not seem the definite solution, and leave them act to his leisure neither. I decided go by a way intermediate, no react publicly. But if asked to a cousin Hudson, that fungi era as species of intermediate asked him, that explained to my mom and Wyatt that this was my future, that did not pretend steal them at all, and that if had showed the minor empathy my grandmother of insurance would have included also to them. Well, son with good will access to try it. Meanwhile, my day and day passed between the queers of the bakery, the gestions of inscription to the university, and the preparation of my final exams of preparatoria. To times felt me overwhelmed in the morning, reviewed contracts and logistic with Antoine, to the midday attended calls of providers that asked if would change politics of payment, by the afternoon studied in the public library of Glendale to finish my projects of the school, and by the night my grandmother and I dined something light. Resing on each small advance and on the plans that she and my father had idea in his moment. In spite of my nerves and my sadness, by the familiar break, one feeling of enthusiasm burbling by inside felt that was growing to steps enlarged, learning so much of the business as of the life, and on all con moved me know that Evelyn trusted in me and was arranged to open me all the necessary doors, so that in a pair of years was I who took the final reins of Liam's kitchen and bakery. However, the respite did not last a lot. One afternoon, while attended a video lamada with Antoine was arguing the billing of our 3 locals in Glendale, my grandmother went in with the telephone in hand, fronting the frown. Before that could ask it all, extended me the cellular to the another side of the line. Listened the voice of my great Aunt Grace from Texas that sounded me concerned. Daughter, what happened now with Charlotte and Wyatt? They finish of publish another thing horrible in internet. Say me hello. The blood thought that already had seen it all with that first publication defamatoria, but me equivocaba. My mom and my brother had scaled the conflict, saying publicly in his networks that I and the grandmother were conspirando to leave to the family in the street. Accusations so graves went me directly to my room and opened my laptop to read with my own eyes what had written. It was incredibly offensive, affirmed that the grandmother needed a psychiatric evaluation and that I was retaining it in his house, and for if out little Wyatt had gone up ancient photos in which showed as us excluded in the events, when indeed he and my mom never had wanted as. It saw that they were treating of manipulate the narrative, perhaps looking for compassion of people that did not know the real history. I swallowed saliva with strength, had 2 roads answer, and go into a war open of publications, or keep the posture that the grandmother had taught me. After several minutes debating in my mind, went out of the room, arranged to speak with Evelyn. It found it in the kitchen, removing a chocolate hot in an olya of mud as it did when I was girl. His look was reflexive, but it did not have trail of surprise. Grandmother, you read what put this time? Said with the voice temblorosa. I saw it, Hijita, responded with smoothness, is regrettable, but do not think to feed this fire with more fire. I cannot remain me silent, hurts me too much what are saying. Do not remain you silent if this does you damage, but neither engage you in a gone and come of accusations, because will not arrive you to at all well. Finally respired deeply and wrote a brief communique in my personal profile, without nominate to my mom, neither to my brother, without insults, neither resentment, explained my position, counted, as had been the invitation of the grandmother, as me on tier, till last moment of that wanted leave me the business, and as had arisen my decision of remain me to live with her. It was a text concise, full of sincerity, did not mention details that could worsen the things, only wanted that my near circle knew my truth. To the publish it felt as if had removed me a weight of on course. This post did not delay in arrive to eyes of Charlotte and Wyatt. To the day following, my mom sent me a furious message saying that dared to leave it as the bad of the tale, and that sometime would repent of have given the back. Wyatt in change wrote something more brief, have happened you of the grandmother. To the sea is affected me, gave me a wise advice already, is not your problem, Mia, that speak what want you follow forward, and in this focus me to follow forward. Some days after received the formal confirmation of my date of start in the university, beside the allocation of classes of introduction to the administration, basic accountancy, and marketing, among others. Meanwhile, in Liam's kitchen and baker in Isiabamos, a new project modernize a bit the image of the bakery without lose his traditional essence. Antoine proposed me opening an account of social networks to share the more classical recipes of my grandmother, and the idea thrilled me. We began to coordinate small videos, photographs of desserts and anecdotes of the family history, all with the approach positive and near. Do not go to deny that by moments gave me fear that Charlotte or Wyatt used these publications in my against. But the grandmother animated me to do it, saying that the people know who are indeed. While advanced the weeks was noticing something unexpected. Several cousins and uncles of different corners of United States began to send me messages of support, commenting that knew how hard had been for me face this pleading familiar, and that do not felt me guilty by the decision of inherit the business. Receive comments of the style, "Your grandmother is a woman fantastic and are happy of that, follow his steps." This gave me hopes of that not all the clan familiar was divided against us. That yes, the relation with my mom and Wyatt followed broken, did not go back physically to his house, neither even to collect more things. I preferred by the necessary and go building my own space to the side of the grandmother. Still hurt me this coldness. But to sober Poner, and on all that of Evelyn, who each morning rose with a spirit renewed, as if the idea to see to his granddaughter taking the reins of the business gave him life. One day, while revisabamos in forms of costs, the grandmother saw me with tenderness. "Your parents and your brother were a family for me, Mia, but hey, times that one has that put limits clear by very painful that was. Know that hurts you that you are young, and that these breaks leave trail. But if you follow your way late or early will arrive the moment to heal or to at least surpass this pain." "Thanks," grandmother responded with a nod in the throat. Expect that sometime they understand that did not want do them damage. That night, by first time in months, slept in peace, embraced to the memory of my dad, feeling that of some form was fulfilling what he always had wanted, that fought by my dreams, and that took care of the family that indeed wants me, and although did not know Camus, neither one would finish this conflict, had the determination to follow forward and no leave me demolished by the lies that Charlotte and Wyatt diffused. My goal was clear: graduate, do grow Liam's kitchen and bakery, and honor the memory of my father. The rest, with a bit of faith and goodwill, would go accommodating with the time. Story 4. My brother with a twisted mind insists on proposing to his girlfriend during my graduation. He has everything planned to ruin my big day, but I warned his girlfriend, and she left him before he could carry out his plan. I am about to graduate from university in November, and everything was going wonderfully. We planned a small party with friends and family at the local park in our city in Texas, something intimate but meaningful. My older brother, whom we will call him, has always been a bit complicated, to put it mildly. A few months ago, he started dating a girl he met at work. At first, she seemed genuine. She is incredible, super intelligent, and has great plans for her career. But as often happens with him, things started to get weird. He has always had this need to be the center of attention, and I cannot help but feel that he is trying to force his own narrative into mine. One day, during a family dinner, he dropped the bomb. He plans to propose to his girlfriend during my graduation ceremony. Yes, you heard it right. Just when I am about to receive my diploma, he plans to kneel in front of everyone to propose. At that moment, everyone thought he was joking, but he was not serious. I cannot believe he wants to ruin my day like that. My graduation is a moment I have waited for years, and now he wants to turn it into his own romantic event. I tried to reason with him, telling him that my graduation is not the right time for his proposal. But he simply did not understand. He insisted that it would be the perfect place. "Everyone will be here. It will be a memorable moment," he said with a confident smile. I felt completely frustrated. I decided that I was not going to allow him to do it. I spoke with our family, but everyone seemed hesitant or simply did not want to get involved in what they considered a matter between brothers. My father was too busy with work, and my mother simply nodded her head, probably thinking that he had a good reason for wanting to do this. But I knew that there was no good reason. He simply wanted to steal the show on my special day. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spoke with my brother's girlfriend. I did not know her very well, but I knew she was a decent person. I told her about my brother's plan, and to my relief, she was as upset as I was. Together, we devised a plan to stop him. We decided that she would talk to him directly, making him understand that my graduation was not the place for his proposal. We wanted to give him an elegant way out so that he would not feel humiliated but also make it clear that we were not going to allow him to interfere in my day. The day of the graduation was approaching, and the tension was increasing. My brother noticed that something was wrong, but he could not figure out exactly what. The day of the graduation arrived, and everything seemed perfect. The ceremony was emotional, and when the moment of my brother's proposal arrived, his girlfriend took the microphone. "I want to tell everyone about something very important," she began, visibly nervous. I have been thinking a lot about my future, and it was at that moment that she decided to interrupt him. "I am sorry, but this is not the right time for this," she said firmly. "I am very happy for my name, and I do not want this day to be tarnished by something that should not happen here." The crowd was silent for an instant before erupting in applause. My brother was in shock, speechless. He could not believe that she had stopped his plan like that in front of everyone. He tried to say something, but she simply smiled and returned to her seat. After that, things calmed down a bit, but not without leaving certain tensions. My brother was visibly upset, but at least my graduation was not ruined. After the graduation, the family atmosphere began to tense up. My brother, visibly affected by what had happened, became even more distant. He did not talk much during the following weeks and avoided any interaction with me. However, the real challenge was yet to come. A few months after the graduation, I got engaged to my girlfriend, and we organized a simple but meaningful wedding in a beautiful chapel in Las Vegas. We decided to make it small to maintain the intimate atmosphere and avoid any family drama that might arise, especially after what happened at my graduation. My brother, however, did not seem to understand. Once again, he was trying to interfere. During a wedding planning dinner with our parents and some cousins, he mentioned casually that he would like to include something special in the ceremony. I thought he was just looking for a way to reconcile, but soon I realized that he had other plans in mind. "I am thinking of doing something special during the ceremony," he said with a smile that he could not hide his enthusiasm. "Perhaps a surprise for everyone." My heart began to beat faster. I remembered how he tried to stop his proposal at my graduation, and now it seemed that he had something else planned for my wedding. I decided to remain calm and ask for more details. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. "Oh, you know," he replied with an air of mystery. "Just something that will make this day even more memorable for everyone." I could not afford to ignore this warning sign. I decided to talk to my fiancée, and together we began to devise a plan to anticipate any attempt by my brother to steal the spotlight again. As we progressed in the preparations, I noticed that my brother was beginning to behave strangely. Mysterious calls, enigmatic messages, and long hours away from home. I could not help but suspect that he was plotting something. One day, while reviewing the final details of the wedding, I received an anonymous message that said, "Beware of your brother, he is planning something big." At first, I dismissed it as a joke, but then I remembered his intentions at my graduation and decided to take it seriously. I decided to confront him directly. "Hey, I have heard that you are planning something for the wedding. What is it about?" He looked at me with surprise, and for a moment I thought he was finally going to apologize, but he did not. "I just want to make this day unforgettable for everyone," he replied with a fake smile. "There is nothing to worry about." However, my intuition told me that I could not trust his words. I decided to increase security measures for the ceremony. We hired a professional event coordinator and asked them to take care of all aspects of the planning, leaving less room for unexpected surprises. The day before the wedding, my brother appeared unexpectedly at our house. "I just wanted to talk to you before the ceremony," he said, his tone serious, contrasting with his usual carefree behavior. "Okay, let's talk another time," I replied, trying to remain calm. However, he insisted. "It is important. I just want to make sure that everything goes well." Finally, I invited him in, and we sat down in the living room. "Listen, I understand that you want to be part of my special day, but I need you to respect the boundaries. I do not want you to interfere with the ceremony." His expression changed, and I could see a mixture of frustration and sadness in his eyes. "I am not trying to ruin anything," he stated. "I just want everyone to be happy." "Your presence is already a reason for happiness," I replied firmly. "But I need you to trust that we have planned everything to make this day perfect for us. Please respect that." After a few minutes of silent tension, he nodded slowly. "I am sorry, I just wanted the best for you." Despite his words, I knew that this would not end there. I had to be prepared for any eventuality on the wedding day. I decided to talk again with my fiancée and the event coordinator, making sure that everything was under control. Finally, the big day arrived. The chapel was decorated with beautiful floral arrangements, and everything seemed perfect. The guests were seated, and the ceremony was about to begin. I felt a mixture of nervousness and emotion as I walked towards the altar with my fiancée. Just when we were beginning to exchange vows, my brother appeared in the crowd. My heart skipped a beat, thinking that perhaps he would try to interrupt again. However, this time the situation was different. He approached the front and took the microphone. "Friends and family," he began with a voice that showed sincerity. "I just want to say a few words on this special day. I am proud of my brother and of everything he has achieved. I wish you both a life full of love and happiness." It was a brief but meaningful speech. There were no proposals or unpleasant surprises, just sincere words that showed that despite his previous attempts, he had learned to respect my important moments. The ceremony continued without setbacks, and at the end we hugged as a family. Although our relationship with my brother still had its ups and downs, this day marked a small step towards better mutual understanding. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that sometimes even the most difficult people can find a way to show support and love, even if it is in unexpected ways. Now, as we enjoy our reception and celebrate the beginning of our life together, I feel that we have overcome an important test as a family. However, I know that not everything will be resolved immediately. Emotional wounds take time to heal, and the family dynamic will take time to balance. But for now, I am grateful for the peace that we have finally found on our special day. After the wedding, things seemed to have calmed down in our family. The ceremony went without incident, and although the tension with my brother was still present, at least there were no more attempts to interrupt my important moments. However, the peace was short-lived, and soon I discovered that things were not as resolved as I had hoped. A few months after the wedding, I moved to New York to begin my new job at a prestigious marketing firm. It was an opportunity that I could not pass up, and although I was excited about this new chapter, I also felt the absence of my family, and especially of my brother. The video calls with my wife and my brother were uncomfortable, full of unresolved tensions and superficial conversations. One day, while checking emails in my new apartment in Manhattan, I received a text message from my brother. "I need to talk to you. It is urgent." I could not help but feel nervous. After everything that had happened, I did not know what to expect. I decided to call him immediately. "Hello," I said when he answered. "Thank you for returning my call," he replied with a voice that sounded more serious than usual. "We have to fix things between us." I sighed. "Yes, I think it is necessary." "What has happened?" "I want to apologize for everything I tried to do at your graduation and at your wedding. I realized that I was being selfish and that I was interfering in your important moments. I am really sorry." I felt a mixture of relief and skepticism. I had heard apologies before, but I had never seen a real change in his behavior. "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that you recognize it." Furthermore, he continued, "I have been thinking a lot about my relationship with her. She and I have decided to take some time to reevaluate our relationship. I think the best thing for both of us is to go our separate ways." I could not hide my surprise. "Her and you? Why?" I realized that I am looking for something that I cannot offer her. She has great dreams, and I do not want to be an obstacle in her path. I want her to be happy, even if it means that we are not together. I felt a pang of relief knowing that he was finally letting go of his desire to interfere in my important events. "That sounds like a mature decision. I am glad that you are thinking about what is best for her." "Thank you," he replied, "and I want you to know that I am trying to change. I have started seeing a therapist to work on my self-esteem issues and my need for constant attention. I want to be a better brother and a better person." Although I still had my reservations, I decided to give him a chance. "I am glad to hear that. If you need anything, I am here." From that moment on, our relationship began to improve slowly. My brother was really trying to change, and although he still had his moments of immaturity, the difference was noticeable. We started to have more sincere conversations and to spend time together without him trying to interfere in my personal events. A few months later, my brother decided to move to Chicago to start a new job and start over. "I want to get away a bit and focus on myself," he explained. Furthermore, the change of scenery will help me stay focused on my recovery. I accepted his decision with a relieved heart. "I think that is a good idea. I wish you all the best." Before leaving, we had a last family dinner at our parents' house in Texas. It was an emotional moment, full of hugs and words of encouragement. My brother seemed calmer and happier than in years past, and although there were still wounds to heal, there was a palpable hope in the air. However, the tranquility did not last long. A few months after his departure, I received a call from my mother. "We have a problem," she said with a worried voice. "Your brother is back home, and he is very distressed." I immediately knew that something was not right. "Okay, what has happened?" "I do not know exactly, but he has been calling all the members of the family asking for help. He is going through a bad time and needs support." I felt a mixture of worry and determination. I knew I had to do something. I decided to take a flight back to Texas to see how I could help my brother. When I arrived home, I found him sitting on the back porch, looking at the horizon with a melancholy expression. I approached slowly. "Hello," I said softly. He looked up and smiled at me. "Thank you for coming." We sat together in silence for a moment, enjoying the familiarity of the surroundings. "What is going on with you?" I asked finally. "I have realized that I still have a lot of work to do on myself," he admitted. "Therapy has been helpful, but there are days when I feel overwhelmed. I decided to come home to be close to the family while I continue with my treatment." I nodded, understanding his struggle. "I am here for you. You do not have to face this alone." "Thank you," he replied. "I really appreciate your support, and I want you to know that I am committed to continuing to improve. I do not want to interfere in your important moments again. I have learned from my mistakes." We hugged, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a real connection with my brother. I knew that the road to recovery would be long and difficult, but I also knew that together we could overcome it. In the following months, my brother began to show signs of real improvement. He returned to his therapy with renewed determination and began to rebuild his life from scratch. He found a new job in Chicago that allowed him to grow professionally without sacrificing his personal well-being, and little by little he regained confidence in himself. Our relationship continued to strengthen, and although we still faced challenges, open communication and mutual support helped us to overcome the obstacles. The family, inspired by my brother's change, also began to look for ways to support each other better, strengthening the bonds that previously seemed weak. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that sometimes the most difficult people are the ones who need help the most. My brother, despite his mistakes and selfish attitudes, was struggling to find his place in the world and to learn to value the important moments without trying to steal the spotlight. Seeing his transformation was a lesson in patience, empathy, and forgiveness. Now, as I enjoy my career in New York and my family continues to grow and prosper, I feel grateful for the opportunity to have saved my brother from himself. Although the past was full of conflicts and challenges, the future looks promising, full of possibilities for a healthier and more harmonious relationship. On Monday morning, while enjoying my coffee in the small apartment in New York, my phone rang with a call from my mother. I looked at the screen and saw her name, which always meant that something important was happening. "Hello, son," she said with a voice that denoted concern from the first second. "Hello, Mom, what's up?" I replied, feeling a knot in my stomach. "It is about your brother," she began. "He has had an accident. He is in the hospital here in Texas." My heart skipped a beat. My brother, whom I had begun to see in a more positive light, was in danger. "What happened? Is he okay?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "I am not sure of all the details, but they say he was involved in a car accident. They are doing everything possible to keep him stable," she replied quickly. Without wasting time, I hung up and called my fiancée, who lived with me in New York. "We have to fly to Texas. It is about my brother," I explained. Within hours, we were at the airport boarding the flight to Dallas. As the plane took off, I could not help but think about everything we had been through. My brother had been struggling to improve, and now he faced a situation that could endanger his life. Upon arriving at the hospital, my mother was already there, waiting nervously. We quickly headed to the emergency room. The receptionist informed us that he was in surgery and that they could not give us more details until it was over. I spent the next few hours in the waiting room with conflicting thoughts in my mind. On the one hand, I felt relieved to know that he was receiving medical attention. On the other hand, I was worried that all our progress could fall apart if he did not get out of this situation. Finally, after what seemed like eternal hours, a doctor came out of the operating room. He approached us with a serious but reassuring expression. "Your brother has suffered a serious traffic accident. He has had several fractures and traumas, but thanks to the rapid interventions, we are stabilizing him and he is receiving the necessary care." I breathed a sigh of relief. Although the worry was still present, is he conscious? Yes, but he is in an induced coma to facilitate his recovery. It is a necessary measure, but we are doing everything possible for him. I decided to stay by his side along with my mother and other members of the family who had arrived to support us. As the days passed, I realized how much it really meant to me to have him by my side. Despite our differences and past conflicts, we were family, and his well-being mattered to me. During his recovery, I spent most of my time in the hospital. My brother, although unconscious, reminded me of the difficult moments we had overcome together. I found myself reflecting on our relationship and how, despite everything, I still felt a deep desire to support him and help him heal both physically and emotionally. One day, while I was sitting next to him, I held his hand and whispered, "I am here for you, brother. No matter what has happened, we are going to overcome this together." Over time, my brother began to show signs of improvement. Little by little, he regained consciousness, and although the road to complete recovery would be long, he was taking positive steps. It was during this period that I truly understood the value of family and the importance of being present in difficult times. As he recovered, our relationship began to strengthen even more. Sincere talks and genuine apologies became an integral part of our daily interactions. I realized that despite his past mistakes, he was making a real effort to change and become a better person. One day, while we were chatting in his room, he said to me, "I have been thinking a lot about everything that has happened. I want to thank you for being here for me even when I did not deserve your support. You will always be my brother," I replied sincerely. "We are in this together." As his health improved, so did our relationship. We decided to spend more time together doing activities that we used to enjoy before life separated us. We visited local parks, watched movies, and simply talked about our lives, strengthening the bond that had been worn down by time and tension. However, life has a curious way of keeping things interesting. One day, while we were reviewing some financial documents for his recovery, I discovered something unexpected. There was a notification in his email indicating that he had inherited a property in California from a distant relative he never knew. Intrigued, I asked him about it. "Do you know anything about this?" He shook his head. "No, I have no idea. I had no knowledge of any relatives in California." We decided to investigate further and discovered that there was a great uncle that we had never heard of. We decided to visit the property to see what was happening. Upon arriving, we found an old but well-maintained house with a beautiful view of the Pacific Ocean. It was an opportunity that neither of us had anticipated. During our visit, we met an older woman who turned out to be the legal representative of the property. She explained that due to certain family misunderstandings, the property had been left without direct heirs and therefore was assigned to my brother. "It is a wonderful property, and I think it could be a great opportunity for him," she said with a kind smile. "It would be fantastic if he could find a new beginning there." My brother was excited but also overwhelmed by the responsibility. "I do not know where to start, but this could be just what I need to continue with my recovery and start over." We decided that he would move to California once he was fully recovered. It was the change of scenery he needed to keep moving forward and leave behind old habits. Furthermore, it would provide us with an opportunity to rebuild our relationship in a new environment away from the tensions of Texas and New York. In the following months, we worked together to prepare for the move. We hired professionals to handle the logistics and began to plan how he could settle into his new home. It was a period of hope and anticipation with the promise of a better future. Finally, the day of the move arrived. We said goodbye to my brother with hugs and words of encouragement, knowing that this change could be the impetus he needed to keep moving forward. As I watched the moving truck drive away, I felt a mixture of emotions. Sadness for the physical distance, but also optimism for what the future might bring. Back in New York, I immersed myself in my work with renewed energy, knowing that my brother was taking significant steps towards a more stable and happy life. Our relationship had gone through many trials, but each challenge had strengthened us in some way. However, life does not stop, and soon I found myself facing a new crossroads. I received an even bigger job offer in Los Angeles, an opportunity that could catapult my career to levels I had never imagined. But this meant another move, this time even further from my family and my brother. As I reflected on the offer, I realized that this could be another opportunity to continue growing, But I also knew that I would have to balance my career with maintaining the family relationships that meant so much to me. I decided to accept the offer, convinced that I could handle both aspects of my life with the right time and effort. So, with a new city ahead and a brother who had finally found his way, I embarked on another chapter of my life. The most important lesson I learned was that despite the adversities and conflicts, family love and support can overcome even the most difficult challenges. Story 5. My teenage sister got pregnant with my boyfriend. Now my parents want to marry them off and give them half of my inheritance, while cutting me off when I am against it all. It all started 2 years ago when I met Alex at the university in Boston. I was 24 years old studying psychology, and he was 27, already working in a technology company. Our relationship was intense from the beginning. It seemed that we were perfect for each other. We spent 2 wonderful years full of laughter, shared dreams, and promises of the future. After our second season of vacationing together in Miami, I decided to introduce him to my family. My parents, my younger sister Laura, 19 years old, and my brother Diego, 15 years old, were excited to meet the person who made me so happy. Alex integrated quickly. He was kind, fun, and seemed genuinely interested in each of us. I thought that everything was fine, that I had found someone in whom I could trust completely. However, 5 months after that introduction, everything changed. One day, while reviewing messages on Alex's phone, I discovered something that I never imagined. He was cheating on me, but the worst thing was not only the infidelity, but that my sister Laura was pregnant. I felt as if an avalanche enveloped me. Not only had I been betrayed by my partner, but he had also taken advantage of family trust to take advantage of my sister. I decided to confront him, but he denied everything vehemently. I did not want to believe that he could have done something like that, but the evidence was irrefutable. I felt devastated, as if all the pieces of my world were crumbling around me. My parents, upon hearing the news, reacted in an unexpected way. Instead of supporting me, they decided that the best thing for Laura and Alex was to get married to protect the baby and keep the family reputation intact. My heart broke seeing how my parents not only accepted this situation, but also planned to strip me of my inheritance to give it to them. They told me that it was for the good of the family, that I should put Laura and Alex above my feelings. I tried to explain to them that this was not fair, that I also deserved to be heard, but my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The tension at home became unbearable. My friends tried to support me, but I felt that I was alone in this battle. My sister, although young, did not seem to understand the pain that she was causing me. She was excited about the arrival of her baby and saw the marriage as a blessing, completely ignoring the chaos that she was causing in our family. I decided to move away temporarily, moving to a small apartment in New York to think clearly, but the conflict did not disappear. My parents insisted that I return and support their decision, threatening to cut off all contact with me if I refused. I found myself at a crossroads. Should I sacrifice my happiness and my inheritance for the good of the family, or should I fight for my rights and my well-being? Each day that passed, the situation became more tense. The calls from my parents were constant, full of reproaches and demands. My friends tried to cheer me up, but the weight of the betrayal and family pressure overwhelmed me. I knew that I had to make a decision, but I did not know what the right path would be. In the midst of all this, I received devastating news. My father had passed away unexpectedly. The sadness for his loss was mixed with the frustration of family tensions. My parents asked me to attend the funeral, but I knew that it would not be easy to face them in these delicate moments. I decided to stay in New York, trying to stay out of it while I processed my pain and planned my next move. The situation became even more complicated when, after the funeral, I discovered that my parents had tried to modify my father's will to favor Laura and Alex even more. I could not allow them to take away what was rightfully mine. After reading my father's letter and facing the fury of my mother and sister, I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. On the one hand, I finally knew what my father really thought of me, but on the other, family tensions seemed to intensify instead of diminish. My brother Diego, although still young at 15 years old, showed a surprising maturity by supporting me. His support was a ray of light in the midst of the darkness that loomed over our family. I decided that I could not stand idly by while they tried to strip me of what was rightfully mine. I began to investigate my legal options. I hired a lawyer specializing in inheritances and wills, someone who could defend my interests without prejudice. My lawyer, Mark Thompson, was a middle-aged man with an impeccable reputation in Boston. We met several times to review all the available documents and evidence. Meanwhile, Laura and Alex wasted no time in trying to undermine my position. They filed a lawsuit in the Safe County Court alleging that the will had been falsified and that my father had been coerced into changing his final dispositions. They claimed that there was a typographical error that gave them an unfair portion of the inheritance. Mark assured me that we had a solid case backed by my father's letter and several testimonies from friends and colleagues who confirmed his desire for me to be well cared for. The dispute became a media hotbed. The local media began to cover the case, presenting it as a family drama full of betrayals and manipulations. My friends in New York were worried about how this would affect my reputation and my future. I felt that my personal life was becoming a public spectacle, and it was getting harder every day to maintain composure in the midst of all this chaos. My relationship with Diego grew stronger. We spent hours talking, planning strategies, and supporting each other. He, despite his youth, had a clear perspective and constantly reminded me of the importance of standing firm. His unconditional support was crucial to keeping my hope alive. On the other hand, Laura and Alex intensified their efforts. They tried to influence other family members to take their side, arguing that I was acting out of envy and bitterness. They even contacted some of my former friends trying to paint a negative picture of me. It was exhausting to see how those I trusted began to doubt me. But Mark reminded me that the case was based on facts and not on rumors. One day I received a call from Mark with good news. We had found a clause in the will that confirmed my father's clear intention to leave me a significant portion of the inheritance. This reinforced our position in court and weakened the claims of Laura and Alex. However, we knew that we still had a battle ahead. As the months passed, the case unfolded in court. I attended all the hearings despite the stress and anxiety. Every time I entered the court, I felt a mixture of determination and nervousness. The sessions were long and often emotionally exhausting, but I knew that I had to stay strong for myself and for Diego. In a particularly tense moment, I received an unexpected visit from an old college friend, Sarah. She had become an independent journalist. Upon learning of my situation, she offered her help. Sarah wanted to investigate further and document my story, making sure that the truth came to light. Although at first I hesitated, I finally accepted, recognizing that her intervention could tip the scales in my favor. Sarah began to interview me and collect additional evidence. We discovered that there were inconsistencies in the testimonies of Laura and Alex and some documents that suggested that the alleged typographical error was in fact a deliberate strategy to manipulate the will. With Sarah's help, we were able to present this evidence to the court, which further strengthened our case. Meanwhile, my mother continued with her erratic behavior. Sometimes she showed signs of regret, trying to reconcile only to blame me again shortly after. The relationship with her became even more tense, and I realized that I could not expect any kind of support from her. My only real ally was Diego. The pressure of the legal battle affected me deeply. The nights were the worst. I woke up sweating and with my heart racing, thinking about everything that I had lost and what was still at stake. However, I also felt a renewed determination. I could not let the betrayal of my ex and the complicity of my family destroy everything that I had worked for and dreamed of. Finally, after an arduous process that lasted almost a year, the day of the verdict arrived. The Safe County Court was crowded with relatives, friends, and journalists filling the room. Mark and I were prepared, although the nervousness was palpable. Laura and Alex were also present, trying to maintain composure before the crowd. The judge took the floor and after a brief deliberation announced his decision. The will was declared valid and my right to a significant portion of the inheritance was confirmed. The accusations of falsification and coercion were dismissed due to the lack of concrete evidence. Laura and Alex were forced to withdraw their lawsuit, but not without threatening future legal actions. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. I felt a surge of relief and triumph, but also a deep sadness for what had happened. I looked at Diego, who smiled at me with pride, and I knew that despite everything we had come out ahead together. However, the victory did not bring immediate peace. My mother continued to show signs of resentment, and Laura and Alex began to distance themselves even further from the family. The inheritance that I finally obtained not only represented financial resources, but also the validation of my struggle and my resilience. I decided to use a part of the inheritance to help Diego with his studies, making sure that he had the opportunities that he deserved. I also invested in my own professional development, expanding my career in psychology and offering support to people who, like me, had faced betrayals and family challenges. Despite everything, the emotional wound remained. The relationship with my sister never recovered, and the bond with my mother became even more distant. However, through all this pain, I learned the importance of self-affirmation and the defense of my own rights. I knew that although I had lost a part of my family, I had gained something much more valuable: my independence and my inner strength. After the verdict, life did not return to normal immediately. Although I had won a significant portion of the inheritance, the emotional wounds were deep and the family environment was still toxic. I decided to focus on rebuilding my life, but the challenges seemed to have no end. A few months later, I received an offer to work in a prestigious mental health clinic in San Francisco. It was an incredible opportunity to advance in my career and move even further away from the turbulent family life in Boston. With Diego's support, I made the difficult decision to move. I knew that it would be a new beginning, an opportunity to heal and focus on myself. San Francisco turned out to be a vibrant city full of possibilities. I settled in a small apartment near the center, enjoying the energy and diversity that the city offered. At work, I met wonderful people who helped me rediscover my passion for psychology. I began to receive patients who had gone through situations similar to mine and found a new satisfaction in helping them overcome their traumas. However, despite the advances in my professional life, family tensions did not completely fade. One night, while dining at a restaurant with Diego, we received an unexpected call. It was Diego who informed us that there had been a serious incident at home. Apparently, Laura and Alex had tried to sell the house without my consent using falsified documents that they had obtained after the verdict. This movement not only put my inheritance at risk, but also represented a new attempt to destroy me. Immediately, I decided to return to Boston to face this new threat. At the airport, Diego explained to me that he had tried to stop them, but that they had managed to escape with some important documents. With no time to lose, I contacted Mark Thompson again, and we began to prepare a new legal defense. Upon arriving in Boston, the tension in the city was palpable. Laura and Alex, aware that their actions had been discovered, had become more aggressive and manipulative. They began to threaten me with additional legal actions and to try to divide our family even more. My mother, who until now had maintained a position of neutrality, began to show herself more hostile, defending the actions of Laura and Alex under the pressure of her own fear and guilt. We decided to take drastic measures. Mark recommended that we obtain a restraining order against Laura and Alex to protect us from any attempt at intimidation or additional sabotage. We also began to thoroughly investigate their financial movements to discover any other attempt at manipulation or fraud in the past. During this time, I received unexpected support from Sarah, the journalist who had documented my case. Sarah was convinced that Laura and Alex were involved in more dishonest activities than we initially thought. With her help, we were able to obtain information about other businesses in which they were involved and evidence of their attempts at corruption and fraud. This not only strengthened our legal case, but also began to publicly expose their actions, weakening their position and reducing their influence. As the legal process advanced, my relationship with my brother Diego became even closer. We spent every moment together working on strategies and supporting each other. He, despite his youth, had a clear perspective and constantly reminded me of the importance of standing firm. His unconditional support was crucial to keeping my hope alive. The constant pressure began to affect my mental health. Sleepless nights and anxiety were a constant, but I found comfort in therapy and in the community of San Francisco. I attended support groups for people who had gone through family betrayals and found a network of people who understood my pain and offered me unconditional support. Finally, after an arduous year of legal and personal battles, the time came to present our final evidence in court. The evidence we had gathered was overwhelming. Laura and Alex's attempts to manipulate the will, their attempts to sell the house, and their dubious financial activities. The judge, after reviewing all the evidence, made a decision that would finally put an end to this nightmare. Laura and Alex were found guilty of fraud and manipulation of the will. They were ordered to return everything they had tried to appropriate and were imposed a considerable fine. In addition, The restraining order was reinforced, guaranteeing that they could never approach me or Diego again. The legal victory was an immense relief, but the emotional scars remained. I decided to dedicate a part of my inheritance to create a foundation to help people who had been victims of family betrayals and legal frauds. I wanted to transform my pain into something positive, helping others to overcome their own challenges. In the process, I began to heal and rebuild my life. My career thrived, and I began to give talks on resilience and personal growth, inspiring many with my story. Diego, for his part, decided to pursue a career in law inspired by our legal battles and dedicated himself to fighting for justice. Although my relationship with my mother never returned to being the same, I learned to accept her as she is. I could not change her perception or her behavior, but I could choose how to respond to her actions. I chose to focus on my own well-being and that of my brother, leaving behind resentment and pain. San Francisco became my home, a place where I was able to find peace and purpose. Despite all the pain and betrayal, I managed to transform my life and find a new happiness. Although I had managed to overcome one of the darkest stages of my life, the road to complete healing was still full of challenges and unexpected discoveries. The creation of the foundation to help people who had been victims of family betrayals and legal frauds became a fundamental part of my new identity. I felt that by transforming my pain into a noble cause, I was not only honoring my father's memory, but also finding a deeper purpose in the midst of adversity. San Francisco continued to be my refuge, a city that offered me the opportunity to reinvent myself and build something meaningful. My talks on resilience and personal growth began to attract the attention of more people, and soon I found myself collaborating with local organizations to expand the reach of my foundation. Each story that I heard reinforced my conviction that mutual support and empathy could transform lives. Diego, inspired by our shared experiences, immersed himself in his law studies with an unbreakable determination. His passion for justice led him to participate in pro bono projects defending those who could not defend themselves. His academic success and his commitment to the cause strengthened our bond, turning us into an inseparable team, both personally and professionally. However, the tranquility that we had achieved began to be threatened by a new, unexpected twist. One day, while reviewing some documents in the Foundation's office, I received an anonymous letter. The content was cryptic but alarming, insinuating that Laura and Alex were not alone in their attempts at sabotage and that there was a hidden network behind their actions. The letter mentioned names and locations that I did not recognize, suggesting that there were more people involved in their fraudulent maneuvers. I decided to share the letter with Diego and Mark. Together, we analyzed the information and tried to identify any connection that it might have with previous cases of fraud and manipulation of wills. The investigation led us to discover that Laura and Alex were part of a clandestine organization that operated in various cities in the United States, specializing in extortion and financial fraud. This network, known as the Shadow, had a reputation for being extremely dangerous and difficult to dismantle. Determined to stop this threat, Diego proposed collaborating with local and federal authorities. We contacted a former colleague of Mark, the FBI Special Agent Laura Martinez, who had worked on similar cases and was interested in our situation. With her help, we began to collect more solid evidence against the Shadow, establishing connections between multiple cases of fraud that seemed orchestrated by the same network. As we advanced in our investigation, I realized that my foundation could also be a target. The Shadow saw in our work a threat to its operations, since we were empowering the victims and exposing the tactics of manipulators like Laura and Alex. To protect ourselves, we reinforced the security measures in our facilities and began to work more discreetly, sharing information only with those in whom we trusted fully. In parallel, my personal life also experienced significant change. I began to date again, finding comfort in new relationships that were based on trust and mutual respect. I learned to open up again, leaving behind the fear and distrust that I had developed over the years. My experiences had taught me the value of authenticity and the importance of surrounding myself with people who really cared about my well-being. One day, while organizing a conference on resilience at the Foundation, I met Emily, a therapist specializing in trauma and emotional recovery. Her empathetic approach and her passion for helping others resonated deeply with me. Our connection was immediate, and soon we became partners both professionally and personally. Together, we expanded the services of the foundation, offering workshops and more complete support programs for those who had suffered similar betrayals. The investigation against the shadow also began to bear fruit. With the collaboration of the FBI and the evidence that we had gathered, we managed to identify several key members of the organization. Laura and Alex, aware that their movements were being tracked, tried to divert attention to other victims, but our evidence was overwhelming. Finally, in a joint operation, we managed to dismantle a significant part of the shadow, arresting several of its members and putting an end to its fraudulent activities. The fall of the shadow was a triumph not only for us, but also for all the victims who had been exploited by this network. The news spread widely, and our foundation received recognition for its crucial role in dismantling this criminal organization. This achievement further strengthened our mission. Story 6. My parents abandoned me at 13 with my grandmother because they couldn't stand my strange illness. Now they demand my inheritance to help my brother with his problems. Hello everyone, I'm Natalie, and I'm 22 years old right now. I wanted to share this story here because, frankly, I have nothing to lose anymore. Telling everything, as usually happens in stories, sometimes one needs to vent, and this is the perfect place to do it. My life hasn't exactly been a fairy tale, but I don't want to show myself as a perpetual victim either. I've simply been through a lot that has led me to become the person I am today. You see, I was born in San Antonio, Texas, and grew up with my parents, Henry and Elizabeth, until I was 13, which was when my life took a radical turn. I have a brother named Daniel, 3 years older than me. For my parents, Daniel was always the ideal child, athletic, with decent grades, and supposedly without medical complications. Instead, I grew up with a fairly intense generalized anxiety disorder, and, to top it off, I was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease when I was barely 7 years old. The disease caused me constant joint pain and skin rashes, accompanied by extreme fatigue that sometimes left me out of commission. My condition worsened in times of stress, and that made my childhood very complicated. My parents used to refer to me as the drama queen or the sick girl, and they didn't say it with tenderness precisely. As I grew up, I realized that the disease was not the most difficult thing to cope with. What was really hard was the atmosphere in my house. My father, Henry, has an explosive temperament and is extremely obsessed with the perfect family appearance. My mother, Elizabeth, is somewhat cold and distant, always more concerned with what people think of us than what we actually feel inside the house. Even when I had attacks of pain or anxiety, my parents' priority was that I not exhibit too many symptoms in public. I came to feel that hiding my illness was more important than my own well-being. The worst thing was that Daniel, my brother, enjoyed privileges that made me feel doubly excluded. I remember when he turned 16 and my parents threw him a big party with friends, a pool, and live music. 2 months later, when I turned 13, they asked me if I preferred to do nothing because maybe I wasn't in the mood with so many people due to my pain. For me, that wasn't a show of empathy, it was just a way to save themselves the effort. Basically, they gave me an afternoon of hamburgers in the yard, and there wasn't even a cake. I never forgot that. Despite everything, I still loved my parents. It was that kind of unconditional love that we have when we are children, and we don't fully understand why the people close to us hurt us. But everything changed definitively during my first year of high school. I began to have stronger crises of anxiety, constant pain, and the occasional skin reaction that temporarily disfigured my arms and neck. My mom said it was disgusting and didn't want me to attend family gatherings so as not to embarrass her. My dad, on the other hand, began to isolate me in my room every time I showed signs of discomfort, as if hiding me would solve the problem. The tension was escalating. My parents were bothered that I missed so much school due to my disease outbreaks, and the teachers asked them to seek specialized help. They interpreted it as if I were a lazy person who dramatized in order not to study. Unfortunately, my grades began to drop, and when my illness became complicated and the doctor recommended a more expensive and specific treatment, my parents saw it as the straw that broke the camel's back. From their perspective, it was too much expense for a daughter who didn't perform, while Daniel supposedly needed support to fulfill his dreams. That's when I realized that in practice, I was not their priority. I remember that day perfectly. I was 13 years old, newly turned, and I was at home very weak from a strong episode of my illness. I listened to my parents argue in the living room, but I didn't fully understand what they were talking about. Suddenly, my father entered my room and told me to go out to the truck with my things, that we were going to visit my grandmother Margot for a few days. My grandmother Margot had always been my emotional refuge. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in Houston, in a small house, but full of old family photos. Every summer, I spent a few weeks with her, and those were my best childhood memories. But this time things were different. When we arrived at her house, my parents didn't stay for dinner, not even to greet her with affection. They lowered a couple of suitcases with my clothes and my books and gave me an explanation more than brief. You are going to stay with your grandmother for as long as necessary. Things at home are very tense, and we believe that you will be better here. That was all. There were no hugs, no, I love you, and not a single tear on their part. They didn't even tell me when they would come back for me, and I, in the middle of the bewilderment, could only watch them leave without looking back. The face of my grandmother Margot said it all. She was as shocked as I was, although she tried to remain calm so as not to upset me more. She took my hand and told me that if my parents had decided that way, we should face it. She didn't have much, not even a big house, but she would do everything possible to make me okay. It was the first time in months that I felt a bit of relief, although I also felt enormous pain. I had just assumed that my parents had abandoned me there for being a problem. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. My grandmother didn't understand how my parents could have made such a drastic decision, and neither did I. They had called me selfish and complicated before leaving, arguing that I only knew how to cause problems with my illness. I didn't hear anything from Daniel. He continued with his life, and I suppose he didn't want to ask much either. For me, staying with my grandmother was a 180-degree change. Although she didn't have great economic stability, she offered me something that was scarce at home: love and attention. During that first month, I began to improve a little. Margot took me to a local doctor who took the time to listen to my symptoms and review my history. In addition, she put me in contact with a therapist who helped a lot to control my anxiety. That was the kind of care that I had never had from my parents. At some point, the question of whether they would be better without me crossed my mind, and although it hurt to think about it, I had the feeling that yes. That broke my heart. Wanting someone who doesn't want you is one of the worst feelings in the world. The hardest thing was realizing that probably that abandonment wasn't temporary, but definitive. My grandmother received a few calls from my mother, but they were always fleeting and cold. The only thing she asked was if I was calmer and if I was behaving, as if everything was reduced to my behavior. There was no mention of school, of my health, not even of the date on which they could come to see me. Margot would get very angry after each call and preferred not to tell me details so that I wouldn't get depressed. It was clear that things weren't going to improve soon. It still costs me to narrate all this without breaking down. Being abandoned at 13 years old isn't an experience that anyone can easily process. But if anything has been clear to me, it is that one doesn't choose the biological family that touches him. Sometimes the real family is the one that offers you their hand when everything crumbles, and for me that person was, and still, is my grandmother Margot. I had no idea that the biggest twist in my life was yet to come, and much less imagined that years later my own parents were going to return begging for something that they didn't deserve. But to understand how we went from abandonment to begging, we must follow the story step by step. That is what I will try to tell you in this series of parts. Hopefully, if someone else has gone through something similar, they can find a little support or comfort in my words. When I arrived at my grandmother's house, I had no idea how long I would stay there. I thought that maybe a couple of weeks or a few months, enough for my parents to clear their heads and reconsider. Although, to be honest, deep down I knew that if they had reached that extreme, the situation didn't look good for me. I remember that in the first days I was invaded by the sensation of having been banished from my own family. My heart was in pieces, and it was hard for me to talk without crying. Margot made an effort to make me feel comfortable. She assigned me her guest room, which was small but very cozy, with an old lamp that belonged to my grandfather and a window that overlooked an orange tree in the yard. The sunsets in her house were special. The pink light would sneak through the window, and my grandmother always took advantage of that moment to sit in the rocking chair in the living room and read. Sometimes, if I felt like it, I would join her. She asked me about my feelings, and I would try to explain to her what was going on inside my head: the anxiety, the fear of rejection, the guilt for getting so sick. She told me that she understood my anguish and that no one deserved to be excluded for suffering from something that they didn't choose. It was the first time that an adult really listened to me without judging or minimizing my symptoms. Despite this, adapting to my new life wasn't easy. My grandmother Margot was very different from my parents. She really cared about my health, but didn't have many economic resources. She lived on the pension that my grandfather left her and some savings that she had saved. We talked at length about the cost of my medicines and the care that I needed. To my surprise, she confessed that she was willing to pay for my treatment even if it meant sacrificing some comforts. That moved me more than I can express. It wasn't just the fact that she invested her money, but the enormous difference in attitude compared to that of my parents. It became clear to me that true affection has no conditions. As the months passed, and in order not to fall behind in school, my grandmother spoke with the principal of a nearby public school. She explained my condition and my anxiety, and a plan was organized so that I could attend classes without neglecting my health. Some teachers, like Professor Juliet in charge of language and literature, showed empathy and did everything possible to adapt the exams to my limitations. Other teachers were somewhat cold, but at least they didn't judge me as much as in my old school where reputation was a very high factor for my parents. In Houston, I began to feel that it was possible to have a less rigid educational environment where I wasn't required to always be at the level of Daniel, the perfect son. Speaking of Daniel, I rarely heard anything about him. From time to time, my mother would call my grandmother's house more out of obligation than out of affection and would let out some fleeting news. Daniel won a basketball tournament, Daniel got good grades, or Daniel got permission to drive. She never asked in detail how I was doing. It was as if she was ashamed to show a minimum of interest. Margot would get very indignant after each call and preferred not to tell me details so that I wouldn't get depressed. She would insist that the best thing I could do was concentrate on my studies and my well-being. During that year and a half, I experienced a mixture of relief and pain. Relief because in Margot's house, I didn't live with the constant tension of being criticized for my illness. Pain because I knew that my parents were still out there and didn't make the slightest effort to recover me or at least visit me decently. My grandmother and I faced each outbreak of my disease with the help of local doctors. She would drive to the clinic, wait for me in the room, and when I returned she would cook something soft for the stomach since the medication sometimes left me nauseous. I don't know how I would have survived without her. Little by little I began to improve academically thanks to my grandmother's consistency. I even began to feel a little safer and even formed a very nice friendship with a classmate named Audrey who lived a couple of streets away. Audrey had an affable personality and didn't care if I had to stay home several days because of my ailments. She would bring me the class notes, keep me company during my study hours, and sometimes we would watch movies on her laptop. She was the first real friend I had, someone who didn't judge me for my appearance or for my relapses. That time, although full of challenges, taught me to appreciate what it is to have true family support. I understood that a blood tie doesn't guarantee unconditional love and that there are people like my grandmother willing to lend you a hand without thinking twice. However, inside me still lived the sadness of having been abandoned. There were nights when I locked myself up to cry, asking myself why they didn't love me. I tortured myself thinking that maybe if I were stronger or had fewer medical complications, my father and my mother would want me back. One afternoon, my grandmother took a document from her drawer and told me that legally it was possible for me to remain in her care for as long as necessary. I noticed it as an act of protection. She wanted to have formal custody so that my parents wouldn't come looking for me suddenly alleging rights, or worse, force me into violent situations if one day they woke up with another mood. My grandmother looked at me with so much tenderness when she explained it that I couldn't help crying again, this time for infinite gratitude. I knew that my life was no longer going to be the same, but at least I had her. As the second year of living in her house progressed, my parents practically cut off communication. My mother stopped calling, and my father didn't even bother to know anything about me. It was hard to assume it, but it was also liberating not having to deal with their criticisms. On the other hand, Daniel continued to be their pride and was getting fully involved in sports with the hope of entering the university with a scholarship. I wished him the best despite everything, because he was still my brother, and deep down I missed our childhood games before my illness became so noticeable. Thus passed about 2 years. My health had ups and downs, but in general I improved. The therapy with the psychologist Marion allowed me to better control the anxiety and my autoimmune disease. Although it didn't disappear, It began to yield with the appropriate medication and a more tranquil lifestyle. You could say that I began to build my life from scratch in Houston. Of course, I never thought that years later the wheel of destiny would give another unexpected turn. My parents, who had left me without remorse, reappeared with nothing pleasant demands when they found out about the issue of an inheritance. But that is a topic for the next part of this story. I'll tell you in advance that from one moment to another the world of my grandmother and mine would be shaken again by the presence of the same people who turned their backs on us. After my second year living with Margot, I managed to graduate from high school thanks to a lot of effort and her unconditional help. I was 15 years old when I arrived at that graduation. I had advanced quickly in my alternative training and special exams, and it was one of the most emotional days of my life. My grandmother was present at the ceremony and applauded me with the same pride that any loving mother could show. It wasn't the most ostentatious graduation in the world. It happened in a small local auditorium, but for me it meant a before and after. I was leaving behind the insecure girl who constantly felt excluded to become a young woman eager to move forward despite my condition. During the following couple of years, Margot insisted that I prepare for university. I had my doubts, especially due to my grandmother's economic situation, but she repeated to me again and again that money shouldn't be an obstacle and that if she had to mortgage her house or ask for loans, she would do it willingly. That idea of indebting us made me anxious, but I began to look for scholarships and affordable options. In the end, the perseverance bore fruit. I managed to be accepted into a program that supported young people with particular health conditions, and they offered me a partial scholarship. That was a great shared victory. Margot cried with happiness the day we received the letter of acceptance. Meanwhile, on the side of my parents, the silence became more and more noticeable. Daniel, my brother, if he gave signs of sporadic life, but never directly towards me. Sometimes some distant relative would tell my grandmother that Daniel continued with his sports career, that he was applying to various universities, and that my parents were very proud of him. Of me, never a comment. There were no calls, messages, or news. Deep down, I believe that distancing continued to be better than putting up with their constant criticisms. However, things began to change on the edge of my 17 years when Margot received a surprise visit. My parents showed up at her door as if nothing had happened, accompanied by Daniel. It was a very strange moment. It was the first time that I saw my father and my mother in almost 3 years. I felt a lump in my throat when I heard them speak with Margot in the kitchen, faking kindness, as if all the neglect of the past didn't exist. My grandmother maintained her composure, but I, who was in my room, could hear part of the conversation. Henry alleged that they wanted to see me, that they wanted to know how I was. Elizabeth let out some ambiguous comments about feeling my absence and believing that maybe it was time for me to return home, as if all this time they had never had the opportunity to visit me or call me. I heard my grandmother answer with a tone so firm that it surprised me. She reminded them that they had spent years without sending a single penny for my support and that they were the ones who decided to leave me there. She told them very clearly that if their intention was to recover me without giving explanations, they were very wrong. At one point, Daniel intervened and asked where I was. I confessed that I felt a little guilty for spying behind the door, but my curiosity could more than my nerves. I slowly went out to the hallway and saw the three of them in the living room. Daniel looked at me with certain timidity. He was noticeably different, taller, more robust, but with the same look as when we were children. He didn't seem angry or anything, just uncomfortable. When greeting me, I noticed a hesitation in his voice, as if he really didn't know what to say. We exchanged some very basic phrases. How have you been? How is school? And little more. It was rare, almost surreal. My parents, on the other hand, let out a speech about the family and how much they missed everything being well. Their tone was forced. Within a few minutes, they began to bring up that Daniel was preparing to go to the university and would need extra money for a sports program in Dallas. I, for my part, maintained a serious face without knowing where the conversation was going until my father let out something that left me frozen. Your grandmother must have certain savings, and we believe that we can reach an agreement so that the family benefits, don't you think, Natalie? That was a low blow because I realized in a second that my mother and my father had appeared with a clear objective to convince Margot to put money for Daniel. Margot didn't take long to answer them that her savings and her financial affairs didn't concern them, and that if their intention was to use me as a bargaining chip, they had knocked on the wrong door. I remember the face of indignation of my mother when hearing those words. It was then that I understood the truth. I was invisible to them except in the moments in which it suited them to bring me out for something economic or reputation. I looked at Daniel, and he lowered his head, avoiding my gaze as if he didn't want to admit that he participated in the same circus. In the end, that visit ended with my father enraged and my mother with a grimace of repugnance. After they left, Margot maintained her composure and asked them to leave. As soon as they left, I broke down in tears. I felt rage, pain, impotence. Why, after so much time without talking to me, were they coming with demands? What twisted logic led them to think that I and my grandmother owed them something? That was the beginning of several uncomfortable episodes. Although my parents returned to indifference for a few months, I already had the certainty that they would return sooner or later. I had heard rumors that Daniel wasn't performing enough to earn a full scholarship, and my parents were desperate to ensure him a high-level university future. Meanwhile, I turned 17 and prepared to enter the university with the help of Margot. In the meantime, my grandmother began to have health complications, nothing serious at first, some back pain and fatigue, but she refused to consider herself old or sick and continued to take care of me as always. At 18, I moved into a student residence near the university where I had been accepted. It was a gigantic change. For the first time, I lived outside the house of Margot, dealing with my illness and my anxiety in my own way, although always with the emotional and monetary support to the extent possible of my grandmother. I thought at that time that my parents would give up trying to extract money from me. The rumor was that it was no small thing, and Henry and Elizabeth must have heard those same rumors, because overnight my mother began to send me text messages, quite cordial, asking about my studies, how I was health-wise, and even offered to accompany me to medical appointments if needed. It was impossible not to notice the change of attitude. That first kind approach generated in me a mixture of anger and suspicion. After all, they hadn't shown the slightest interest in me until the possibility of an economic benefit arose. But at that moment, I remained with a cool head and concentrated on my classes. I answered her messages in a courteous manner without allowing them a real approach. Every time they consulted me on my grandmother, I said that she was fine without giving more details. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed to be going through an academic slump. Sometimes comments filtered through some cousin or aunt indicating that my parents were displeased with him. His promising sports career didn't end up materializing, and they needed to pay for personal trainers or intensive programs so that he wouldn't lose the level. Money was a hot topic in my biological family, and my name began to come up more than I would have wanted. I closed my first year of university with decent grades and a notable advance in the management of my illness thanks to the treatments and a less stressful rhythm of life than the one I had in my adolescence. The following summer, I returned to my grandmother's house in Houston, and I found her health somewhat deteriorated. In that moment, I glimpsed reality. Time does not forgive, and Margot was no longer as strong as when she took me in at 13 years old. But that didn't stop me from enjoying every moment at her side. We cooked together, watched old movies, went for walks in the neighborhood when her strength allowed it. She repeated to me that whatever happens, I should believe in myself. I don't know what would have been of my life without her guidance. And that is how the events precipitated. As my grandmother's health declined, my parents Henry and Elizabeth appeared more often with increasingly less convincing pretexts. By then I suspected that sooner or later would come the direct confrontation around the inheritance. What I didn't imagine was the magnitude of the shamelessness that they were going to show when finally Margot was missing. But that, friends, I will tell you in the next part, where I will explain how the conflict over the inheritance arose and how my parents ended up begging me in the most ironic and painful way for money that didn't belong to them. I had already finished my first year of university with all the support that my grandmother gave me since she took me in at 13 years old. And if something was clear, it was that the presence of my parents, so forced and sudden, could not bode well. During that summer in Houston, my grandmother made an effort to appear strong. The idea that I would abandon my studies to dedicate myself to taking care of her full-time terrified her, so she insisted that I continue with my reading routine and with my small online investigations for the university. But as the weeks passed, her exhaustion became noticeable. There were days when she could barely leave her room, and others in which she seemed to recover energies by fits and starts. Her doctors diagnosed her with a complicated heart condition that required constant supervision. Even so, Margot, proud as always, dodged any suggestion of being hospitalized. In that time, my parents began to visit my grandmother's house more frequently than in all the previous years. They arrived with the excuse of seeing how she was and of reconciling with me. but without needing to be very suspicious, I captured their true intentions. Several members of the family commented that Henry and Elizabeth could be looking for a way to convince Margot to change some will, or at least to make them alone on a large scale, supposedly to invest in the future of my brother Daniel. Daniel, for his part, looked more distant than ever. I had the impression that he was in an internal conflict. Although he was always the favorite of my parents, I noticed that his sports career wasn't advancing as he expected, and that the economic tensions overwhelmed him. In one of those visits when my parents went to talk alone with Margot in the living room, Daniel stood in the hallway looking at me in silence. I tried to start a conversation and ask him how he felt, but he answered with monosyllables and avoided my gaze. "Everything okay, Daniel?" I said to him with a genuine tone. "Yes, I suppose, just I don't know." It was his longest response in that whole summer. I would have liked to have a real approach that he would tell me his problems. However, the family tension was so strong that it seemed impossible to talk without feeling that lump in my throat. Despite the ups and downs, my grandmother managed to maintain her temper, but near August she began to suffer strong pains in the chest accompanied by severe fatigue. One afternoon in the full heat of Houston, I had to take her urgently to the hospital. There they stabilized her and recommended absolute rest and more constant medical care. My parents appeared that night in the waiting room faking concern. Elizabeth put on a face of pity and let out Natalie for something. "We say that it is better that you are not alone taking care of your grandmother. We can help you." I wanted to laugh with bitterness because helping wasn't what they had done in all these years, but I preferred to remain silent so as not to upset her. Margot stayed hospitalized a couple of days, and then they discharged her with the instruction that she shouldn't undergo physical efforts, nor at a very few time after that scare Margot decided to put her affairs in order. One morning she called me to her room and extended me a closed envelope with a loving gesture. She explained to me that there had the copies of her will she had drafted it years ago, specifying that the house in Houston, the bank accounts, and the majority of her possessions would pass to my name save some minor clauses for certain cousins and nephews. I remember having remained in shock, though I suspected that she considered me her heiress. I didn't imagine that practically everything was destined for me. "Natalie," she told me with her soft voice, "it isn't because it is much wealth, but because it is all that I have. I want to make sure that you are protected when I fail. I know how your parents have been, and I don't want you to feel helpless again." I cried in silence while I hugged her. I didn't know what to say. I never asked nor wanted anything of her money. The only thing that I yearned since I was 13 years old was to feel loved and cared for. Margot understood it, and what she saw was that I could follow my path without anyone snatching her house or her savings by force. Unfortunately, my grandmother's health worsened in a matter of a couple of months. In mid-November, she suffered another hard episode, and in this time, she didn't manage to recover. She passed away in the hospital at dawn with my hand intertwined in hers. It was a blow that I still didn't assimilate completely. My pillar, the person who saved my life in more than one sense, departed too soon for me. She was 69 years old, but that silent illness took her without compassion. I remained sunk in the sadness, organizing the funeral and contacting the relatives. Ironically, my parents appeared immediately and claimed the protagonism. Elizabeth gave orders on the flowers and the mass, while Henry spoke with the parish priest, as if he was a great friend of the family. The rage consumed me in silence, because I couldn't believe that after years of negligence they would present themselves suddenly acting as devoted children. The funeral was simple but emotional. Friends of Margot, some neighbors and relatives arrived to say goodbye to her. Daniel also was present, quite serious. I had to one side listening to the prayers and feeling an indescribable void inside. I wanted to shout to everyone that my grandmother was my real mother, that thanks to her I had opportunities and didn't end up on the street, but I limited myself to crying, feeling a mixture of sadness and liberation. The reading of the will and the confrontation just a couple of weeks after the departure of Margot, the lawyer of the family cited the interested parties for the formal reading of the will. I already knew what it said, but I preferred to remain silent until the lawyer read it aloud. Henry and Elizabeth were there with expectant faces, and Daniel arrived late and sat down without greeting me even. When the lawyer announced that I was the universal heiress of the majority of the goods of my grandmother, my parents were silent for an instant. Then Henry began to cough nervously, and Elizabeth, with incredulous expression, exclaimed, "How only our daughter didn't consider his own son, that is to say Henry, in nothing." The lawyer impassive explained that if there were small assignments for other relatives but the house and the main account remained in my name, I avoided looking at my parents directly, although I felt their contained rage. Daniel, on the other hand, had his gaze nailed to the floor. At the end of the reading, my parents cornered me in a hallway of the office. Between aggressive whispers, they let out the bomb. "You have to help us with Daniel. He is going through serious problems." It turned out that my brother had had complications, not only academic, but also personal. Apparently, he had become involved with dubious friendship and needed treatment. My parents, in the same line, as always, demanded that I as family cede them a part of my inheritance to pay for the rehabilitation of Daniel. They didn't speak to me with affection, nor did they ask me for comprehension. It was rather a tone of "we owe you because you are our parents." In that moment, all the painful memories came to my mind. My childhood, the contempt of my parents towards my illness, the day that they took me by force to the house of Margot and abandoned me. How did they expect that I would respond with a "yes, of course, here, you have all the money that you want"? I told them with a trembling voice that if Daniel needed help first, they should recognize what they had done to me. Of course they refused. Henry became a fury, and Elizabeth branded me as ungrateful. Hearing them say those words churned my stomach. However, I wasn't the same defenseless 13-year-old girl. Now I was 22, and I knew that my grandmother had left me those resources to protect me just from situations like this. I made it clear to them that I wouldn't give them anything if they didn't publicly admit their mistakes and their snubs. It was one of the most tense scenes of my life. Daniel, head down, didn't say a word to defend me. A part of me wanted to help him, especially if he was in a serious problem, but not at the cost of silencing and pretending that my parents had been angels. Thus ended that initial confrontation. My parents left, throwing me looks of hate and murmuring under their breath that I would regret it, and I, with my heart broken, I remained there in the office of the lawyer, holding the papers that legally converted me into the heiress of the little or much that Margot left. That bittersweet sensation is not forgotten. I was grateful with my grandmother for safeguarding my future, but it pained me enormously that the last experiences around her death were so miserable and full of reproaches.